He was a man everyone whispered about, the one who filled his shed with rust and broken motors, while bills stacked higher than hope. Even his wife told him to grow up, to sell the tools and quit chasing scrapyard dreams. But late nights and stubborn hands built something no one saw coming. When the machine finally roared to life, it didn't just light a few bulbs. It lit up a whole future. Neighbors who once mocked came knocking. Cameras arrived. $1 million checks followed. Yet when success found him, Eli Mercer went back to where it began, a rusted yard and a quiet promise to himself. Would you have believed in him? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The nights in Millhaven came quiet and heavy, the way they do when industry has gone away, but the memory of it still lingers in the brick and rust. Eli Mercer sat on an old stool in the shed behind his house, a single yellow bulb casting a circle of light over a battered workbench. The space smelled of oil and damp sawdust, of long-cooled welding rods and forgotten ambition. Outside, the wind pushed at the warped-tin walls and rattled loose shingles like a half-hearted applause for another night spent hunched over bent steel. He had been there since supper, where conversation had thinned out the way it usually did. Dana had made boxed macaroni and stared at the stack of bills wedged under the salt shaker. She didn't say much until he stood, scraping back the chair and announcing he'd be out back. "Of course you will," she'd muttered, not loud enough to count as an argument, but sharp enough to carry the weight of one. Now, hours later, her voice still lived in the back of his mind as he worked the teeth of an old gear with a wire brush. Eli wasn't careless with the things he salvaged. Each piece came from somewhere. The ironworks had shut down before he was born, the grain elevator gutted last spring, the yard behind Martin's garage where busted transmissions went to die. He walked through those silent graveyards and saw possibilities where others saw trash. A splintered flywheel might be the heart of a new drive system. A length of pipe might cradle bearings if coaxed just right. His hands, broad and marked by years of welding and fabrication, moved with the patience of someone assembling a puzzle only he could see. The shed itself was a kind of shrine. Along one wall hung coffee cans of bolts and screws, each labeled in his slanted handwriting. Against another, leaning sheets of metal axles and fan blades waited for their turn to matter again. In the corner, an ancient drill press stood beside a welder patched together from two different eras of machinery, both saved from the scrapyard and kept alive by his ingenuity. There was a hum to the place when Eli worked. Not electricity exactly, but a low current of concentration, of an idea trying to be born. Inside the house, Dana was awake, the glow of the television flickering across her tired face. She had once loved the shed, back when Eli made furniture and fixed tractors for neighbors. It used to bring in a little extra cash. But after the last shop closed and he lost his union job, the tinkering became something else. Less side work, more obsession. Each time he dragged home a new heap of metal, she felt hope and weariness collide. "You can't build a life out of junk," she told him the week before, when another power bill came past due. He hadn't answered, only looked down at his boots and gone back to the shed. Tonight, he tried to ignore the echo of her disappointment. A salvaged alternator sat open on the bench. It's got spilling wires and copper windings. He turned it slowly, thoughtful, watching how light caught on the worn housing. There was an idea nibbling at the edges of his mind, something about capturing lost heat and turning it back into power. He didn't have the math for it, not yet, but he had instinct, the same quiet sense that let him fix what others threw away. That instinct was all he owned some nights. The town around him had gone still long before midnight. Empty mills crouched to the river's edge, windows punched out like broken teeth. The streets where thousands once poured out after shifts now held nothing but stray cats and the occasional truck on its way somewhere better. Yet here, in this patch of backyard and tin walls, there was a faint, stubborn hum of life. Eli Mercer's hands kept moving. He wasn't sure what he was building, only that it felt important, and that no amount of laughter from the other side of the kitchen wall could stop him from trying. Morning came slow to Millhaven, a gray light sliding over brick shells and shuttered windows, revealing the bones of factories that once fed the town. Steel mills with their smokestacks cut off mid-breath stood silent against the horizon, rust running down their sides like dried blood. The old forge where Eli's father had swung a hammer was nothing but a hollowed hangar now, windows boarded, weeds forcing their way through cracked concrete. Freight tracks lay half-buried under weeds and years of dust. The trains that used to carry finished goods out of the valley had stopped long ago. Eli drove his dented pickup through these quiet corridors after breakfast, coffee cooling in a chipped thermos, bed of the truck rattling with yesterday's finds. He liked to move slowly through the skeleton of what Millhaven had been, scanning with a craftsman's eye. A heap of twisted conwood glinted faintly behind a chain-link fence. He marked it in his mind. Farther on, a torn-down paper mill had coughed up copper piping and a tangle of belts. These places felt holy to him, not sad but alive with potential. The town had turned its back on the wreckage. He still saw the language of machines written in every bolt and flywheel. Sometimes he parked at the edge of the biggest yard, a sprawl of scraps stacked like crude sculptures against the sky. There, men in stained coveralls smoked and sorted, calling out greetings to Eli when he climbed down from the truck. They knew him as the quiet one who paid fair and left quick, who never took more than he could use. He walked among gutted engines and twisted frames, touching metal the way others might test fruit for ripeness. His hands came back dusty and bright-eyed, carrying pieces no one else bothered to notice, a shaft still straight, a bearing that might spin true with care, a heavy motor housing thick enough to outlast another lifetime. It gave him a kind of quiet pride, the scavenging, to take what had been thrown away and imagine a future for it felt like a small act of defiance against the slow decay swallowing Millhaven whole. Where others saw trash, he saw a structure wing be revealed, like sculpture hiding in stone. That belief steadied him when everything else, work, bills, respect, had slipped. Dana didn't come on these trips anymore. Once or twice she had, years back, riding shotgun while he talked about projects and potential. Now she stayed home or took extra shifts at the diner, muttering about the smell of oil and the way metal dust clung to her jeans. She told friends, half joking but sharp-edged, that her husband collected junk like a crow and called it engineering. When Eli backed into the driveway with a load of battered steel and greasy motors, she didn't come out to watch. Sometimes she stood at the kitchen window instead, arms folded, mouth set in that tight line he'd come to know. He didn't blame her entirely. The jobs that once paid well were gone. The projects he promised to sell rarely did. More than once she'd asked him what all this bending and welding amounted to, and he had no answer that sounded sensible, only that it mattered, only that something was there, under the rust, if he could find the right shape, to her. The piles outside the shed were just unpaid bills in another form, hours spent on dreams instead of overtime, proof that he was drifting further from the solid life she wanted back. By noon, the truck would be full again, an uneven cargo of cast-offs tied down with fraying rope. Eli would climb behind the wheel and head home slow, watching the silent smokestacks in the rear view. The town might have given up on itself. Dana might think he joined in that giving up, but the weight of the scrap in the truck felt different to him. It was potential, raw, and stubborn. It was proof that not everything abandoned was worthless. He drove back to the shed with something like quiet dignity, holding on a hope that one day what he built out of these bones would stand taller than the ruins themselves. The Saturday market spilled across the courthouse, square the way it had for decades. White pop-up tents, long tables of preserves, rows of homemade candles, and yard sale furniture polished enough to pass as antiques. A fiddler played near the fountain, his case open for tips, and the air smelled faintly of kettle corn and motor oil from a handful of hobby mechanics showing off small engines. Eli parked his battered pickup along the far curb, careful not to block anyone's view. In the bed sat 3 pieces he'd spent the week shaping. A squat wood stove built from an old compressor tank, a garden cart welded from bicycle wheels and steel tubing, and a lamp stand twisted elegantly from salvage wrought iron. He unloaded slowly, shoulders curved, aware of eyes that always seemed to find him. People didn't outright laugh. Not most of them. But the glances were quick and full of something heavier than curiosity. A couple of men from the old mill nodded politely and moved on. A pair of teenage boys snickered when they saw the stove, nudging each other before walking off toward the food trucks. Eli set his things out just the same, wiped his hands on a rag, and leaned against the truck's tailgate as if waiting for the world to notice some quiet worth in what he'd made. Across the square, Dana lingered near a booth selling handmade soaps, pretending to browse. She hadn't wanted to come at all, but felt it would be worse if she didn't. She kept her back stiff, pretending she didn't hear the low, knowing voices drifting from a table of church ladies. Bless his heart, still at it, poor Dana. Another vendor smiled at her with a softness that stung more than cruelty would have. Sympathy was its own humiliation. It said everyone could see the gap between what she'd hoped her life would be and what it was. Hours passed in the thin autumn light. Customers admired the lamp, asked about the cart, rammed their hands over the cool steel of the stove, but no one bought. Some admired and then stepped back, murmuring something about needing to measure space or ask a spouse. Mostly they just passed by, eyes sliding off Eli's creations the way they slide off a busker. No one wants a tip. Dana stood with her arms folded, coat collar pulled tight, every unsold hour weighing heavier. Once, near midday, an older man with farmer's hand stopped, asked about the stove's burn efficiency. Eli explained its inner baffle system and heat retention. The man nodded, said it was clever work, then sighed and left empty-handed. That gnawed, quiet, uncelebrated, was all Eli seemed to need. It sparked a small, tired smile before fading. By 2 o'clock, the crowd thinned. Dana's cheeks burned with a mix of cold and humiliation. She wanted to leave long before Eli finally wrapped the unsold pieces back in old moving blankets. No words passed between them as they lifted each thing into the truck bed. Only when he latched the tailgate did he glance at her, searching for something in her face. Understanding, maybe, or patience. She looked away toward the fountain instead. The ride home was long and quiet. Dana watched houses go by, each one feeling more anchored than theirs, more solid. Children played in yards, and couples carried groceries in from cars that didn't sputter. She pictured the bills on the kitchen table and the way folks at the diner would look at her when they found out another Saturday brought nothing. She could already hear the soft sking. How long before Dana gives up on his scrapyard dreams? Eli kept his eyes on the road, hands loose on the wheel. The rejection rolled off him differently. It still stung. Of course it did, but the work itself had meaning he couldn't quite explain. He thought of the way the metal had yielded under his torch, the balance of the cart's frame, the way the stove pulled smoke so clean when he tested it. Even if no one else wanted it, he knew what it was. Proof he could turn wreckage into something alive. But beside him, Dana shifted, pulled her coat tighter, and the air between them felt heavier than the scrap in the truck bed. When they got home, she went inside first, shutting the door softly but with finality that said no conversation was welcome. Eli stayed outside for a while, unloading, stacking the unsold pieces near the shed. The lampstand leaned against the wall, graceful and unchosen. He ran a hand down its curve and exhaled, slow and long. Somewhere behind the house, a dog barked once and fell silent. The wind carried the distant groan of the abandoned mill. He wiped his palms on his jeans and looked toward the kitchen window. The curtain moved, maybe Dana watching, maybe just a draft. Either way, he felt the ache of being seen and dismissed in the same breath. Still, he turned back to the shed, to the workbench waiting under its single bulb. Tomorrow, he would go out to the junkyard again. Tomorrow he would pick through bones and try once more. Not because the town believed in him, not even because Dana did, but because some small, stubborn part of him still believed there was something worth making out of what everyone else had thrown away. The kitchen was small enough that every sound carried and stuck. Plates clicked softly as Dana set down 2 chipped dinner plates with fried potatoes and eggs. She moved without looking at Eli, her shoulders tight, jaw locked in a way he'd learned to read long before their words collided. The overhead light hummed faintly. Outside, the late October wind pushed dry leaves against the door. Eli came in from the shed just as she sat. His clothes smelled faintly of burned steel and cold night air, a scent Dana used like before it became constant. He washed his hands at the sink, slow and deliberate, then joined her at the table. For a few minutes they ate without speaking, forks scraping quietly across ceramic. The bill sat between them, a small tower of white envelopes and soft threats. Electric, water, mortgage. Dana's paycheck from the diner lay folded beneath a magnet on the fridge. No check of his to join it. "You know the gas company called again," she said at last, voice low but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "We're past due. They said this is a final notice." Eli chewed, swallowed, kept his eyes on the table. "I'll talk to them. Maybe set up a plan. You said that last month." Her tone didn't rise, but it grew heavier. And the month before. He nodded once, slow, as if absorbing a blow and measuring its weight. "I'm close this time, Dana. I really think." "Close." Her fork clinked hard against her plate. "Close to what?" "Another cart nobody wants. Another lamp that just sits there while people laugh behind my back." "I'm not chasing nothing," he said quietly, but his jaw set. "This one's different. That's what you said about the stove. And the planter. And the—" She stopped herself, looked down, but the words hung there anyway. "I'm working doubles at the diner, Eli. My back hurts every night. And you're out there with piles of junk telling me just one more idea." He leaned forward, hands flat on the table, palms rough and scarred. "It's not junk to me. It's not money either." She shot back before she could stop herself. The silence afterward was raw. They'd been here before, but tonight it felt sharper somehow. The room smaller. Eli pushed his plate away and stared at the bills. "I know what it looks like," he said, voice softer now. "But I'm telling you I feel something on this one. Been turning it over in my head for weeks. Heat reclamation. Small scale. Could mean something if I get it right." Dana rubbed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. She didn't want another fight. Didn't want to crush whatever quiet light kept him going. But the math of their life was brutal and didn't bend for hope. "Feelings don't pay the mortgage," she whispered. He flinched, just barely, then looked down at his hands. "No, they don't." For a while neither moved. The wind rattled the thin window pane, the only sound in the room. Dana finally stood, gathered plates with a scrape that felt final. "I'm tired," she said. "Gotta be up at 5. He nodded, didn't meet her eyes. She left him at the table, alone with a stack of bills and the cooling smell of eggs. He sat for a long time after, head bowed like a man praying, though he wasn't, in the shed beyond the back door. Tools weighted, and scraps of metal caught faint moonlight through cracks in the siding. He thought of them as he sat there, shapes waiting to become something else. Maybe worth, maybe salvation, maybe nothing. Still, he knew before he even rose from the table that when Dana was asleep, he'd go back out there, because it was all he had left that still felt like his. The first frost had settled overnight, turning Millhaven's Junkyard into a glittering sprawl of pale silver. Eli parked the pickup just after dawn, boots crunching on gravel as his breath clouded in the cold air. He liked to come early, before the other scavengers, before the forklift started up, and the day filled with noise. There was something about first light on rusted steel, quiet, promising, as if all the forgotten things were holding their breath. He moved slowly, eyes scanning piles of twisted metal and busted machinery. The yard stretched wide, a maze of stacked car hoods, bent girders, collapsed air ducts. The smell was part oil, part damp iron, part cold earth. In the distance a dog barked once and then stopped. He tugged his gloves tighter and stepped over a tangle of wires half buried in mud. That's when he saw it. At the edge of an old shipping container lay a hulking industrial motor, half obscured by a torn tarp and leaves. Its paint was long gone, replaced by a hide of flake gray and deep rust, but the shape, thick housing, overbuilt casing, the heft of something built in an era when weight meant durability, caught him like a hook. He approached and crouched, brushed away damp leaves with his gloved hand. The cast iron badge was scabbed with corrosion, but enough letters showed to make out Harrington and Sons, Chicago. Not a name he'd seen in years. He tapped the casing with his knuckles. It gave a dense, satisfying note. Heavy duty, industrial lineage. Curiosity pried deeper. He reached into mess and found the shaft still turned, stiff but not seized. Bearings maybe shot, windings probably ancient, but the bones were good. This wasn't just salvage. This was a relic with fight left in it. His chest tightened the way it did when he felt the faint click of an ideal waking. Heat reclamation had been rolling through his head since those nights hunched at the kitchen table. Too much energy wasted in every dime machine around here. Heat bleeding into the air from motors, generators, furnaces. He'd seen numbers once, energy just thrown away. What if he could catch some of that? Turn it back into something usable. Problem was he needed a core strong enough to test with, something to take modification without falling apart. This motor might be it, big enough to experiment on, simple enough to open, tough enough to survive mistakes. He stood and looked around. The yard was still empty, just a faint hum of a forklift somewhere far off. He felt a quick rush, a boy's secret thrill. He'd found treasure where no one was looking. Hauling it was no small thing. The motor must have weighed a few 100 pounds. He went back to the truck for a chain and a come-along, setting up quiet and practiced. Sweat broke across his forehead despite the cold as he ratcheted the beast onto a dolly, coaxing it inch by inch until it rested in the pickup bed with a heavy, final thunk. Standing there, hands on his knees, breath coming in clouds, he looked at it and felt something stir beyond curiosity, something close to hope. On the way home, the motor shifted with each bump, the whole truck sagging under its weight. Dana's car was in the driveway when he pulled in. She was at the diner. Good. He didn't have the patience for another round of eye-rolling right now. He slid the tailgate down and winched the thing onto a shop dolly, sweat soaking his collar though the air bit with cold. In the shed, he cleared a space like setting a table for a guest. He didn't know exactly what would come of it yet, only that this was the sort of find that didn't happen twice. He walked around it slowly, hands in his pockets, studying every bolt and seam. Ideas flickered. How to reroute heat, where to mount a scavenger coil, how to drive a small alternator off wasted thermal push. He could see shapes forming, rough but possible. Outside, the sun climbed a little higher, throwing light through the warped slats of the shed. Dust floated in the beams, slow and golden. Eli reached out and touched the cold iron casing of the motor, a silent handshake between an old machine and a man who refused to quit. He didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a steadiness in his breath he hadn't felt in a long time. Something here could change the math, if he was smart enough, stubborn enough. He didn't hear the kitchen door slam when Dana came home later, or the way she paused at the window, frowning at the new hulk taking up half the shed. He only kept circling, muttering measurements to himself, scratching on a scrap of cardboard with a stub pencil. By evening, the outlines of the new plan had begun to take shape, rough but alive, like sparks enkindling. And for the first time in weeks, the work didn't feel like just escape. It felt like possibility. The house was quiet except for the steady scratch of a pencil and the low hum of the refrigerator. Eli had spread himself across the entire kitchen table again, the same way he used to when the kids were small, and he fixed broken toys late at night. Now the toys were gone and the space was taken by wide swaths of butchers, paper scavenged from the hardware store. Graph lines drawn by hand mapped an engine block like a secret language. Coffee cooled untouched near his elbow, its ring bleeding slowly into the paper. He worked bent close, glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, measuring and marking, erasing and redrawing. An open motor casing from the yard sat on the floor at his feet, oil drained, one side cut away, so he could study its insides while he imagined the changes. He had stripped it down over the past few days until it lay bare and honest. Now he was chasing a way to thread a secondary coil through wasted heat and spin something useful out of what other machines threw away. Numbers crowded the margins. Temperature ranges, gear ratios, output estimates scratched out and tried again. It was well past midnight when Dana padded in wearing her diner sweatshirt, hair pulled into a loose knot. She stopped in the doorway and took in the sight. The kitchen turned into a war room of tools and wire spools, a soldering iron cooling on a plate, bolts lined up like soldiers. He didn't notice her at first. She leaned against the frame for a moment, arms crossed, just watching. The expression on her face was not cruel, but worn out, the look of someone who has seen too many promises come and go. "You're at it again," she said quietly. Eli glanced up, eyes glassy with concentration, then gave a half smile that didn't quite reach his tired face. "Yeah, something's coming together, I think." Dana moved to the counter and poured water into a glass, watching him over her shoulder. Another Eli project? The way she said it wasn't mocking exactly, but it carried the weight of old disappointments. She sat down across from him, careful not to disturb the edges of his paper. You know we're 2 weeks from the mortgage hitting again, and gas. And Winter's not going to care about your numbers. I know. He spoke softly, still drawing. This one feels different. She gave a short, dry laugh. That's what you said about the cart, the stove, the windmill thing. He paused and looked up at her. There was no anger in him, just a quiet stubbornness. I can't explain it, Dana. I just know when something's worth chasing. She studied him in the yellow light, his hands black under the nails, eyes rimmed red. This wasn't laziness. It was the opposite. That almost made it worse. His hope was a thing she couldn't quite kill, and it frightened her because it hadn't fed them yet. You're betting time we don't have, she said finally. He didn't answer right away, only reached for his coffee and took a sip, grimacing at the cold. Time's the only thing I've got to bet, he said at last, voice low but steady. They sat there a while, her drinking water, him drawing lines across brown paper that rustled like dry leaves. She wanted to sweep it all away, clear the table, make him see the world the way the Bills saw it. But something in his face stopped her. The quiet concentration, the flicker of light behind fatigue. Instead, she stood and pressed a hand to his shoulder for just a second. He didn't look up, but she felt him go still under her touch. Don't stay up too late, she murmured, and left him to his papers. When the door to their bedroom clicked shut, Eli exhaled long and slow. He looked at the sketches scattered before him. 1,000 false starts, but one thread of possibility running through. He sharpened his pencil again and leaned closer, chasing the line that might lead them out of the small life closing in. In the silent kitchen, under the thin hum of the fridge, he drew until his hand cramped and the first light of morning crept in under the back door. The diner smelled like bacon grease and brewed coffee, the kind of scent that clung to clothes long after you left. Dana had been on her feet since dawn, weaving between booths with practiced ease. Pot of coffee in one hand, order pad in the other. The place was busy for a Tuesday. Farmers in Carhartt jackets hunched over plates, a few mechanics from the garage across the tracks, and the usual crew of retirees who camped at the corner table trading gossip and weather reports. She kept moving, kept smiling, because work was simpler than the house waiting for her later. It was just after the lunch rush when Carla slid onto the stool next to the pass-through window, blowing a strand of blonde hair off her damp forehead. Saw Eli's truck at the yard again, she said, loud enough for the other waitresses to hear. He bring home anything good this time? Maybe a rocket ship? The line cook chuckled from behind the grill. Betting on another big payday from his junk mountain? Dana smiled because that was what you did. She poured Carla a refill and said lightly, probably another motor. He's got a whole graveyard going out back. Professor Scrap strikes again, Carla said with a grin. One of these days he's going to invent something worth millions, and we'll all be sorry. The table of retirees overheard and perked up like hounds catching scent. Professor Scrap? One of them asked with a chuckle, and Carla gestured toward Dana, eyes twinkling. Her old man, always hauling home junk, tinkering all night, town's very own mad scientist. Laughter rolled across the counter, easy and familiar. Dana laughed too, though a little too sharp, and immediately busied herself wiping down an already clean table. She'd learned how to do that, laugh along so the sting wouldn't show, but it still landed. Each chuckle reminded her of the empty Saturday market stall, the unpaid bills on the fridge, the way people looked at her with a kind of soft pity when they said his name. Hey, said Rita, older and softer, cutting her eyes toward Carla. Leave her be. At least he's trying something. Better than some who just sit at the bar all day. Trying doesn't pay the gas bill, Carla answered, not cruel but blunt. Then, catching Dana's face, she softened. Sorry, hon, just teasing. Dana forced a small smile. It's fine. I tease him too. But it wasn't fine. Not really. Because behind the jokes was a truth everyone seemed to know. That Eli's work hadn't brought in a dime in years. That she was the one keeping the house running on tips and sore feet. That her husband's big ideas hadn't changed anything but the amount of sleep they both got. She finished her shift, letting the chatter slide over her like rain. When she took her break, she sat alone in the tiny staff room and scrolled her phone with numb fingers. She'd laugh in the moment, but now the words rang back. Professor Scrap, $1 million junk. And for some reason, it hurt more coming from friends and strangers. They weren't malicious. They were just tired of waiting for him to become something else. Maybe she was too, by the time her shift ended and she stepped into the weak afternoon light. Dana had tucked the hurt deep where no one could see it. She drove home past the dead mills, the silent tracks, and their small house with the shed crouched behind it. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Eli must be working out there. She parked and sat for a moment, engine off, staring at the shed door. Part of her wanted to march in and tell him what they'd said, force him to feel the weight she carried every day. Another part of her couldn't stand to see his face if she did. The quiet determination would falter for just a second, and she didn't want to be the one to break it. Instead, she went inside and hung up her coat. Through the kitchen window, she could see the glow of his work lamp and the silhouette of him bent over something new. She thought about Carla's easy laugh, about Rita's quick defense, about the bills waiting under the magnet. Then she sighed, turned away, and started supper. The jokes would circulate until the next one came along. She told herself she didn't care. But the echo of them, light as they were, stayed with her through the chopping of onions and clatter of pans, a dull ache she couldn't quite shake. The night had turned raw and damp, fog pooling low across the backyard as Eli coaxed the heavy motor onto a makeshift stand. The shed smelled of machine oil and scorched paint. He'd been at it for hours, wiring, bolting, checking connections twice over. On the workbench lay his rough notes, grease-smudged lines of calculations and hand-drawn diagrams curling at the edges. A small space heater hummed in the corner, unable to push back the cold. He hardly felt it anyway. His hands were steady, eyes alive with a quiet charge that hadn't left him since he'd hauled the old Harrington motor home. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt on the edge of something. He double-checked the coil he'd wrapped to capture the heat he planned to reclaim, ran his fingertips over the patched wires, and tightened one last bolt with his ratchet. It wasn't pretty, nothing boring in the shed ever was, but it might work. He wiped his palms on his jeans and reached for the cord. Dana appeared at the doorway then, hair damp from her shower, sweater pulled tight against the cold. She stood for a moment, watching him fuss with the machine, light pooling behind him like a secret world she couldn't quite enter. "It's after midnight," she said, voice already frayed with exhaustion. "I just need to see if it'll run," Eli answered, not looking up. She exhaled in that long, tired way he'd come to know. Eli, but he was already plugging in the extension cord. The motor gave a low groan, coughed, and began to turn. At first just a slow, reluctant spin, then faster, the improvised coil glowing faintly as it soaked up heat from the casing. Eli's face lit with something childlike. "Look at that," he murmured. Dana took a hesitant step inside, folded her arms. "You sure this is safe?" Before he could answer, the motor lurched violently. A pop rang out, sharp and metallic, followed by a surge of acrid smoke. Sparks snapped across the workbench as a wire shook loose and flailed like a live snake. The small heater went dark. Eli lunged to cut the power, fumbling with the cord while the shed filled with the smell of burning insulation. The motor shrieked once and died with a sputter. "Jesus!" Dana cried, stumbling back against the doorframe, coughing from the smoke. "Are you trying to burn the place down?" Eli yanked the plug free, chest heaving. "It's okay, I've got it." "Okay." She stared at him, eyes wide, face pale in the half-light. "It's not okay, Eli. It's midnight. I'm half asleep. And you're out here playing with God knows what. You could have killed yourself. Killed us." He stayed bent over the machine for a long second, catching his breath. Then, without looking up, he said softly, "I just miscalculated the load. That's all." Dana's voice broke sharp and loud in the cramped space. "This is ridiculous, Eli. All of it. You got smoke pouring out of whatever that is, and bills piling up, and me working every shift I can grab. For what? Another idea? Another one of your projects." He straightened slowly, eyes tired but still holding that stubborn glint. "I almost had it." She threw her hands up, laughless and bitter. "Almost doesn't keep the lights on." For a moment, they just stared at each other, breath clouding in the cold air now that the heater had died. She looked like she wanted to say more, then thought better and turned, slamming the door behind her as she left. Eli stood alone in the smoke-hazed shed, the quiet swallowing everything once she was gone. He unplugged more cords, moved slowly, careful as if handling a wounded animal. The motor sat still and blackened, a thin curl of smoke rising from its casing. He ran a hand over the scarred metal, feeling both foolish and fiercely unwilling to quit. Failure was part of the work. Always had been. He opened a small window to clear the air and stayed there until the night turned silent again. Back in the kitchen, Dana's light had gone out. He imagined her curled in bed, back turned. He closed the shed door, locked it, and lingered a second on the threshold, smoke clinging to his clothes. Inside, the house was dark, safe, ordinary. Out here, his dreams smelled like burned wire and risk. He told himself that one failure was just a step, even if it had nearly burned down everything. Then, exhausted but restless, he scribbled fresh notes on the brown paper before going in. He had seen enough flicker in that brief spin of the motor to believe there was still something worth chasing. A cold Saturday morning broke over Millhaven. Lights slow to reach the backyard where the shed hunched under a skin of frost. Eli was outside early, smoke rising from his coffee mug as he swept last night's debris from the concrete floor. Burned insulation, blackened wire, a small patch on the bench scorched to the color of coal. The ghost's failed test lingered in smell and sight. He moved quietly, shoulders rounded, tired from another night spent trying to wrestle possibility out of stubborn metal. The whole thing still replayed in his head. The lurch of the motor, Dana's shout, the sudden flare of sparks. He felt foolish, but not enough to quit. The rumble of an old pickup broke the quiet. A moment later, a battered blue Ford eased up the drive, doors squealing open before it stopped. Out stepped Gus Avery. Cap pulled low, gray beard wagging slightly in the wind. Gus had been retired nearly a decade now, once the best machinist in the tool and die shop, where Eli's father worked until his hands gave out. He and Eli's dad had fished together, drunk coffee from the same steel thermoses during lunch breaks. After the funeral, Gus had checked in from time to time. Not often, but enough to matter. Smelled like burnt wire halfway down the block. Gus said, grin tugging his weathered face as he looked toward the shed. Figured that was you. Eli chuckled softly despite himself. First run didn't go so smooth. No first run does. Gus stepped closer, boots crunching frost. Mind if I take a look? Inside the shed, Gus scanned the clutter like a man slipping back into a familiar language. He didn't comment on the mess or the black marks on the bench, just squatted near the motor and ran a thick finger over the casing. Old Harrington, huh? Damn thing's older than you. Solid bones, though. Picked it up last week, Eli said. Thought it could handle the load. It can if you treat it right. Gus eyed the coil, the jury-rigged wiring. But you're choking her out with these bends. And this feed wire. Hell, Eli, that's lamp cord. No wonder she spit fire at you. Eli smiled sheepishly. Was working with what I had. Gus snorted, stood with a small groan and looked him over. Your old man used to do the same thing. Scrounge and patch, and then wonder why something cooked. Some things you gotta respect, no matter how clever you get. They spent the next hour side by side. The quiet, companionable, broken only by the occasional clang of tools and Gus's muttered corrections. He traced lines on Eli's brown paper plans with callous finger, adjusting angles, suggesting heavier gauge copper, swapping out a cheap bearing for something better. At one point, he disappeared his truck and came back with a small cardboard box. Inside lay 2 machine couplings, polished and perfect. Made these a while back for a job that never happened. Gus said, setting them on the bench like an offering. Figured you could use, and more than they're using up space in my shop. Eli picked one up, turning it in his palm. It was beautiful, simple, clean, true. Gus, you sure? Better than watching you burn the damn place down. Gus winked. Besides, your dad would have done the same for me. Something caught in Eli's throat at that. His father's name hadn't been spoken out loud in weeks. He cleared his voice, busying himself with sorting the new parts. Thanks. he said finally, quiet but full. Gus nodded and looked around the shed, eyes softening. You keep at it, son. Town's full of folks who gave up when the mills did. You ain't one of 'em. Just be smart about it. Build it to last. When Gus left, the shed felt different. Still cold, still cluttered, but less lonely. Eli stood holding one of the couplings, thumb tracing the smooth edges. He imagined his father's big hands doing the same years ago. Imagined both men standing where Gus had stood. The failure of the night before didn't feel so fatal now. It felt like part of a lineage, men working through scrap, believing something could come alive again. He set the new parts carefully on the bench and looked at his notes with fresh eyes. There was work to do, mistakes to fix, better materials to source. He could almost feel the machine waiting to be reborn under his hands. Outside, frost melted from the shed roof and dripped slow and steady onto the ground. Inside, for the first time in days, Eli felt warmth that had nothing to do with heat or fire. It came from the quiet knowledge that someone believed, maybe not in the dream yet, but in him, and that, for now, was enough to keep him going. The house was dark and still when Eli slipped out the back door, careful not to wake Dana. A heavy hush lay over the yard, the kind that comes after the last car has passed, and even the stray dogs have found somewhere warm. The shed loomed ahead, its warp boards catching bits of moonlight. Inside, he struck a match and lit the old lantern on his bench. Its soft orange glow pushed shadows into corners, but left the room gentle and secret. He preferred it to the buzzing overhead bulb. The lantern felt like company. The day with Gus had filled him with new angles, better wiring routes, stronger couplings. Now, long after midnight, he hunched over the machine and began the slow undoing of failure. He cut away scorched wire, fingers steady despite the chill that seeped through his shirt. Copper shavings curled like tiny flames where he trimmed and stripped. Sweat rose on his brow though the night was cold. Concentration warmed him better than the heater ever could. As he worked, memories seeped in uninvited. His father bent over a different bench, cigarette smoldering in a tin ashtray, humming tunelessly while coaxing life into an old outboard motor. He'd been a boy then, small enough to sit on an overturned bucket and hand over wrenches too big for his hands. His father's knuckles had been split and blackened just like his now. And so was the silence, the good kind, not angry but intent, where metal spoke and men listened. But there was another memory, heavier. One summer his father had unveiled a contraption he'd built out of spare engine parts and a hacked water pump, swearing it could help irrigate small farms for next to nothing. He'd taken it to the county fair, proud, eyes alight with hope. The thing sputtered and smoked in front of a half-circle of men who'd come to watch. Laughter rose quick and cutting, someone muttering, "Tink and nonsense." His father had smiled tightly, packed it up, and never tried again. Eli hadn't forgotten the way his father's shoulders looked afterward. Smaller somehow, though he'd never spoken of it. That humiliation had rooted itself deep, part what kept Eli up now when sensible men slept. He wanted to prove scrap could be more than a punchline. Maybe even finish what his father started. Not the same machine, but the same stubborn fight against giving up. He rewired carefully, using the heavier copper Gus had pressed into his hands. Each connection soldered clean and bright. He swapped bearings, seated the gifted couplings with a slow, reverent twist. The lantern light trembled on sweat and steel. Outside, a train moaned somewhere far off, then faded. In the small hours, time loosened its grip. There was just the work and the whisper of possibility. Occasionally he paused, rubbed tired eyes, and studied his brown paper sketches spread across the table. They had grown messy with revisions, inked arrows where Gus had corrected him, penciled notes scrawled over coffee stains. Yet the shape emerging there felt real, a cleaner loop, a safer way to draw off wasted heat, without overloading the system. By 3, his hands were trembling with fatigue, but his heart thrummed with quiet determination. He tightened the last bolt and sat back on his stool. The motor waited, rebuilt but untested, a dark hulk catching faint lantern glow. He didn't dare plug it in tonight. Dana would hear, and truthfully he needed sleep and daylight to face another failure if it came. But the sight of it sitting solid and whole again filled him with something close to hope. Not the loud kind, just a small flame against the dark. He blew out the lantern and sat a while longer in the sudden cool blackness, letting the silence settle. His father's ghost felt close. Not the man beaten down at the fair, but the one who once taught a boy how to believe in making things. Eli brushed metal filings from his palms, whispered into the dark, "We'll get it right this time," though he wasn't sure if he meant himself or both of them. Then he stood joint stiff and locked the shed behind him. The frost was thick again, crunching under his boots. In the house, Dana's steady breathing reached him faintly down the hallway. He stopped to watch her sleep, face turned to the wall, and felt both guilt and resolve rise at once. Tomorrow there would be more bills, more doubt, maybe more smoke and sparks. But tonight, for a few quiet hours under lantern light, the dream had survived, and that was enough to let him close his eyes. The envelope lay on the kitchen table like a wound, its red ink stamp shouting, "Past due," before it was even opened. Dana had brought it in with the morning mail and set it there beside the salt shaker, where other envelopes already sat, fanned out like a losing hand of cards. She meant to wait until Eli came in for coffee before looking, but patience ran thin these days. So she tore it open alone, eyes scanning the small type until the meaning landed heavy. Foreclosure warning. They were now behind not just on utilities but on the mortgage itself. One more missed payment, and the house her father helped them buy would no longer be theirs. She stayed sitting a while, hands pressed flat to the table, staring at the unpaid stack as though sheer force might make the numbers rearrange themselves. Outside the window, the shed hunched in the weak daylight, its roof patched with tin and hope. Somewhere inside, she could hear the faint rasp of a saw or grinder, Eli already at it, chasing the latest shape his dream had taken. When he finally came in, cheeks red from the cold, hands black with oil, she didn't even say hello. She slid the paper toward him, watched him take it with a nod that was too calm. He read slowly, lips tightening but not trembling, and then set it back down. "I'll handle it," he said softly. Her laugh came out sharp and hollow. "Handle it? With what, Eli? We're out of time." "I'm closer than you think," he answered. But the words were worn from use, and she could hear how little he believed them this morning. "Once I finish this rebuild." "Finish?" She cut in, voice rising before she could stop it. "You've been finishing for years. Stoves, carts, that windmill thing, whatever's out there right now. None of it paid one damn bill." He looked at her then, eyes tired but stubborn. "This one's different." She slammed a palm onto the table, startling herself with the sound. "Stop saying that. Stop pretending scrap and lantern nights and some miracle motor are going to save us. They won't, and you know it." He flinched but didn't speak, which somehow made it worse. Her anger had been building for weeks, fed by jokes at the diner and the quiet shame of telling the bank soon. It poured out now ragged and loud. Sell the tools. All of them. The welder, the grinders, whatever's left. Get a real job, any job. Grow up, Eli. The words hung there between them, heavier than the threat from the bank. For a second she thought he might shout back, but he didn't. He only lowered his gaze, jaw working once before going still. That quiet felt unbearable, like yelling into a canyon and getting nothing back but your own echo. Dana's throat hurt suddenly, raw from more than just shouting. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door, hands shaking, vision blurred with frustrated tears. "I can't do this anymore," she said, voice breaking now, softer but more dangerous than the yell. "Not like this." The door slammed behind her with a crack that rattled the window panes. Outside, cold air slapped her face, but felt cleaner than the room she'd left. She stood on the porch for a long minute, trying to breathe, before she forced herself to keep walking, down the drive, past the dead hydrangeas, anywhere that was within sight of that shed. Inside, Eli didn't move for a long while. He stood at the table, hands spread on the wood, staring at the foreclosure notice as if it were written in another language. Her words had cut deep, but landed where truth lived. Still, selling the tools would be like cutting off a limb. They were more than machines. They were the last tether to the man he believed he could be, the one his father once taught him to try and become. Yet upstairs was a life they were both losing one bill at a time. Finally, he picked up the letter and folded it with care, smoothing the creases until a red warning disappeared under his thumb. He slipped it back into its torn envelope and set it on the counter. Then he went to the back door and looked out across the frost-laced yard to the shed. For a moment his shoulders sagged, and the fight seemed to drain away. But after another long breath, he pulled his jacket back on and stepped outside. The cold biting but welcome. There was no plan yet, no clear answer, only work, and the desperate hope that one more try might be enough to keep the house, the dream, and maybe even his marriage from collapsing altogether. The house was asleep when Eli returned to the shed. No lights glowed behind the kitchen curtains, no movement upstairs. The silence after Dana's outburst still hung heavy in the air, but now it felt like a dare. He pushed the door open, the hinges sighing as if the place recognized the weight he carried. Inside, the lantern's dim circle revealed what had nearly broken him. The battered motor hulking on its stand, wires dangling where last night's fire had spit them loose. A mess of copper and bolts cluttered the bench, but there was something about the ruin that felt alive, as if it were waiting for him to try again. He hung his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and studied the guts of the machine. Every failure he'd had, the scorched insulation, the pop of current shorting out Dana's shouted grow up, had left clues behind. If he could read them. He took his time, moving slow, tracing each circuit with a finger, listening to some quiet inner sense. The problem was clear now. The torque he was asking for outstripped what the patch drive could manage. He'd forced power through a cheap path and paid for it with smoke and shame. He went to his paper notes, still spread across the table like a battlefield map. There, among Gus's penciled arrows and his own messy equations, he saw a small adjustment, an alternate gear ratio that would reduce load while still letting the coil drink heat. He remembered his father's voice once, low and patient as he taught a boy to mend a fishing reel. Let the tool do the work. Don't force it. The next hours slipped by without thought. He swapped a smaller gear for a larger one scavenged from a forgotten mower, filed its teeth until they meshed with perfect, satisfying clicks. He cut fresh wire, thicker this time, copper gleaming rich under lantern light. The couplings Gus had left sat ready. He tightened them down with slow, reverent turns of the wrench. Sweat dripped from his forehead, even in the chill, but his hands never faltered. The shed filled with the smell of warm steel and solder. At last the thing looked whole again. No loose wires, no guesswork, just solid intention. Eli sat back on a stool, breathing hard, rubbing his palms down his jeans. For a long moment he only stared at it, afraid to test and lose again. But something steady lived in his chest. Not bravado, just a quiet knowing. He reached for the cord. The first seconds were tense. The motor hesitated, groaned deep, then caught. Instead of the violent jerk of before, it began to turn heavy and smooth. The coil's metal darkened and warmed as heat fed back into its loops. No sparks this time. No angry smoke. A low, even hum filled the shed, soft but strong, the sound of the machine working exactly as it should. Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His knees went weak. He sat heavily, laughing once under his breath, a dry sound that turned almost into a sob. He touched the housing, careful and light, feeling vibration run up his arm. Warm, alive. It worked. He didn't yell for Dana. He didn't dare wake her with triumph she might not yet want to share. This moment was for him alone, for the night spent doubting but still building, for his father's ghost, for the boy who refused to stop trying. He watched the machine run until the coil's glow deepened and heat shimmered faintly in the cold air. Outside, the wind rattled loose, siding on the milled-down river. The town slept on, unaware that in one small shed a man had finally made something sing. When he shut it down, the silence that followed felt different. Not defeat this time, but promise. He stood there in the quiet, hand on the motor's cooling skin, eyes burning with exhaustion, and a strange, fierce joy. Maybe tomorrow there would be more fights, more bills, more doubt. But tonight he'd crossed some invisible line. He'd turned ruin into power. And for the first time in a long time, he believed the dream might just survive daylight. Morning light slipped into shed in slats through warped boards, turning the floating dust gold. Eli had been running the rebuilt motor for nearly an hour, measuring output with a battered multimeter and watching heat roll off the coil in control waves. Each smooth turn of the shaft felt like a heartbeat. He was dog-tired but couldn't stop smiling. The hum had become a companion, low and alive, proof that something impossible yesterday was real today. He didn't hear the truck at first, just the crunch of gravel outside. Tires on his drive usually meant Dana coming back early from the diner, but this sound was deeper, rougher. He straightened, wary. Through the shed window came the flash of an old green Ford with a crooked tailgate. The door slammed and boots crunched closer. Then a voice, warm but edged with curiosity. "Heard somebody's been playing mad scientist back here." Eli turned as the door swung open. Marcus Vale filled the frame, broad-shouldered under a worn leather jacket, beard going silver at the chin, eyes quick and sharp behind scratched sunglasses. Marcus was known around town as a man who bought and flipped anything worth a dime. Old tractors, pallets of surplus wire, even entire barns if the timber was good. He'd done well enough to call himself an investor these days, though he still drove his own loads. "Morning, Marcus," Eli said cautiously, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't expect company." "Stopped by Martin's yard," Marcus said, stepping inside uninvited. "Old man, there said you hauled out a Harrington motor a couple weeks back. Said you looked like a kid with a secret. Figure I'd see what you were up to." Eli almost bristled, protective of the fragile thing he'd built, but the hum behind him betrayed its existence. Marcus's eyes followed the sound of the running motor, curiosity sharpening into something keener. He walked around it slowly, hands in pockets, gaze raking over the welded stand and copper coils. "What the hell am I looking at?" Marcus asked finally. Eli hesitated, then answered, voice quiet but sure. "Prototype. Waste heat reclamation. Motor runs. Coil pulls off excess thermal and spins a small alternator. Idea is to turn wasted heat back into usable power." Marcus let out a low whistle, bent to examine the coupling, then straightened with a grin that showed just a flash of teeth. "You built this out of junk?" "Scrap," Eli said, bristling slightly. Marcus laughed, a single sharp bark. "Scrap, right? And it works." "It's working now," Eli said, gesturing to the steady hum. Marcus pulled off his sunglasses, studying the machine, and then Eli, "Run it up for me. Show me it's not a parlor trick." Eli's throat felt tight. Having someone else watch, someone other than Dana, was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. He nodded and adjusted the dial, feeding a little more load. The motor deepened its growl but stayed smooth. The coil glowed faintly, heat shimmering upward. No smoke, no sparks, just clean energy coaxed from ruin. Marcus walked a slow circle, nodding to himself. "Hell of a thing," he murmured. Then louder, "You know there's folks paying good money for tech like this? Small operations want off-grid heat recovery. Diesel gen outfits looking to stretch fuel." Eli shrugged, suddenly shy under praise. "It's just a proof of concept. Haven't thought past getting it to run." "Well, think past it," Marcus said, eyes bright now. "Because there's something here. You got patents on this." Eli shook his head, embarrassed. "Not yet." Marcus grinned wider, but there was respect under the mischief. "Figures. Listen, I like making money off what other folks throw away. Been doing it half my life. You got something worth more than scrap here. You ever consider letting someone back you? I could help." Eli swallowed, a swirl of hope and caution rising. Partnership had burned others he knew. Small-town deals turned ugly fast. But the idea of someone seeing value, not laughing, not pitying, was a shock to system. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It's early." "Early is when you get in cheap," Marcus said with a wink. Then his tone softened. "But it's also when a guy can get taken for a ride. Let me help you not get taken. You'll need filings, real parts, maybe a better shop. I know where to find all three." The machine hummed steady behind them, as if daring Eli to dream further. He thought of the night it nearly burned down, of Dana's eyes when she said, "Grow up," of his father's quiet shame. And now here was someone, not a friend, not a neighbor, who looked at the same pile of salvage and saw a future instead of failure. "I'll think about it," Eli said finally. Marcus nodded, clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to sway him. Do that, but don't think too long. The world moves fast. Then Marcus was gone, boots crunching back to the truck, engine firing and fading down the road. Eli stood alone again, the shed humming with the machine's low triumph and something new in his chest. Not just hope now, but the first fragile thread of possibility reaching beyond these walls. Dana came home late, hair damp from drizzle, and her diner shoes squeaking faintly on the kitchen linoleum. She was exhausted in the way that lives in the spine, a slow ache that no nap or aspirin fixes. The house smelled faintly of solder and machine oil, the new scent of most nights. She dropped her purse on the counter and turned toward the back window. Through the wavering curtain, she could see the pale light of the shed and Eli's outline moving there, shoulders bent, deliberate. That quiet determination, once endearing, now struck her as blind. When he finally came in, his hands were black to the wrists, face marked by fine metal dust that caught the overhead light like dull glitter. He looked pleased, not triumphant, just alive in a way she hadn't seen in months. He poured himself water and sat opposite her, pushing a small stack of scrap, drawings across the table, like a boy showing off homework. Marcus Vale stopped by today, he said casually, though his voice held a tremor of something warmer. Saw the build running. Thinks it's got potential. Dana's head came up sharply. Marcus Vale? That vulture? He's not, Eli started. She cut him off with a bitter laugh. He buys dead barns and flips them for parts, Eli. He's a hustler. Everybody knows it. He knows scrap, Eli said evenly. Knows value. Thought the machine could go somewhere. That's what he tells everybody. Dangles a dream so he can take what's left when it crashes. Her voice sharpened as the day's exhaustion poured into this new worry. And you're sitting here acting like this is good news? Eli didn't flinch. He studied the rim of his glass for a long moment before answering. He saw it work, Dana. Not just me believing. Someone else saw. That doesn't mean money. Doesn't mean it'll save the house. She gestured to the pile of bills, still where she left them days ago, only fatter now. No one's getting rich off garbage. The words came out harsher than she meant, but she didn't take them back. They hung in the kitchen like smoke. Eli let them settle, then leaned back, slow and quiet. His face didn't harden or plead. He just seemed tired but anchored. It's not garbage, he said softly. Something in that answer, its simplicity, its refusal to rise and fight, both infuriated and scared her. You really think some backyard invention is going to fix this? After all these years? Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. We're drowning, Eli, and you're chasing ghosts. He nodded once, as if conceding the storm rather than contesting it. Maybe, but it's working now. I know what I've got. That calm made her angrier than shouting ever could. She wanted to shake him, to make him see how close everything felt to collapsing. Instead, she stood abruptly, chair legs scraping across the floor. I can't do this tonight, she muttered, retreating toward the hall. He didn't stop her, just went back to the stack of drawings, sliding one closer and smoothing its edge with his thumb. From the doorway, she turned once, catching the lamplight on his tired face. Not defiant, not broken, just quietly absorbed in the thing he was building. Something in her chest twisted at that. It would almost be easier if he raged back or promised her everything would change. But he simply stayed with his work, like a man who had learned long ago that arguing hope into someone else's heart never works. In their bedroom, Dana sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint sound of him returning to the shed after a while. The door creaked, then shut softly. She imagined him there, lantern lit, turning bolts with that maddening patience. Part of her wanted to follow and apologize, to ask what Marcus had really said. Another part couldn't bear to hear him speak of possibilities when she was so raw with fear. Down the hall, Eli stood once more under his lamp. He touched the motor's casing, still warm from the day's run, and felt no anger toward her, only the quiet understanding of a man trying to build something solid before everything falls away. He wasn't naive. He knew Marcus might be trouble, that Dana's doubts were built from hard math and years of disappointment. But he also knew the machine's hum was real and alive. He'd learned not to argue hope. He would just keep building until the sound of it proved him right. The shed smelled of warm metal and cool autumn air drifting in through a cracked window. Eli had been up since before dawn, checking every connection twice. Today he would know if the machine was only luck or if it truly worked. He'd rebuilt it yet again, careful and methodical, every lesson from failure etched into his hands. The casing was clean now, the coil set firm, copper shining where he'd soldered new joins. It looked, for the first time, not like scrap but like a real machine, small enough to fit on a workbench, heavy enough to promise strength. He rolled open the door to let the cold bite of morning steady him. In the distance he heard Marcus's truck long before he saw it, that deep throaty rumble of an engine rebuilt too many times but still alive. Eli wiped his palms on his jeans, nerves buzzing under quiet. He wasn't much for show, and this felt like one. Marcus pulled up with his usual careless grace, climbing down with coffee in one hand and a grin tucked under his beard. "You said you had something to see," Marcus said, stepping into the shed. His boots clanged against the threshold, eyes flicking to the motor already rigged and waiting. "She ready to sing?" Eli nodded, throat dry. "Think so." Marcus walked around the machine slowly, appraising like a man inspecting a horse he might buy. He whistled low at the tidy wiring. The heavy gauge copper, the polished couplings Gus had contributed. "Damn, you've been busy." Eli didn't answer. He was too focused on the switch under his hand. One slow breath. Then he flipped the breaker. The machine woke with a deep rumble, then settled into a smooth, even hum. The copper coil glowed gently as heat built and fed back into the small alternator bolted to the frame. Meters on the bench began to dance, temperature, voltage, output, all steady. They waited. Minutes stretched. No sparks, no smoke. Just that steady, confident sound, warm and alive. Eli adjusted a valve, and the alternator's needle climbed further, feeding a set of lights he'd rigged across the back wall. One by one they flickered on, bright and clean against the dim shed. The old space suddenly looked like a stage. Marcus's grin dropped into something closer to wonder. "I'll be damned," he muttered, stepping closer. He put a calloused hand near the coil, but not on it, feeling the heat radiating back. It's pulling wasted thermal and turning it back into juice, like legit juice. "Enough to power these and then some," Eli said, voice soft but sure. "Ran my grinder on it last night. Didn't hiccup." Marcus barked out a short laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "And this is all scrounge? No fancy parts?" "Mostly scrap," Eli admitted, almost shy. Marcus turned slowly, taking in the humming lights. The quiet power at work. His eyes sharpened with calculation, but also something like respect. "You know what you got here? Small outfits pay thousands for systems half the size and twice as fragile. Diesel crews, off-grid shops. Even the big plants want to talk energy recovery these days." Eli just shrugged, though inside his chest something fierce and alive uncoiled. "It's just working. That's all I wanted. Working." Marcus's laugh came again, rough and low. "Buddy, it's doing more than working. You've got proof of concept. The hard part's done." He walked a slow circle again, hands on hips now. "Patent this before someone steals it. Get a name on it. Then we talk next steps, fabrication, licensing, whatever. I know folks. Real folks." Eli didn't answer right away. He just watched the lights, still glowing strong, and felt a weight slide off his shoulders he hadn't known was there. Years of failure, of jokes, of Dana's weary sighs and his own father's ghost. All of it seemed to fade under the simple, undeniable hum filling the shed. It wasn't wealth yet, or safety, or forgiveness, but it was proof. The dream had substance. Marcus turned to him, grin crooked, but eyes serious now. "Hell, Eli, I might have come sniffing for scrap, but I'm looking at a damn business." Eli exhaled, slow and deep, letting the truth of that land quietly. He didn't jump or cheer, just nodded once, the corners of his mouth twitching into the smallest of smiles. The shed felt different, larger somehow, charged not by hope alone, but by a machine that had stopped being theory and started being real. The sound of it filled the space and for the first time reached beyond its thin wooden walls, as if daring the world outside, even Dana's doubt, to ignore it. Eli sat at the kitchen table long after sunrise, still smelling of machine oil and cold air. The shed had gone quiet for the first time in weeks. The little recycler sat cooling in its corner, copper coils dull but proud after the long run. He was scribbling notes about voltage curves and wiring paths when he heard the crunch of tires outside. Marcus Vale didn't bother knocking. He swung the door open and stepped in like he'd always belonged there, boots tracking a little gravel across the floor. "Morning, Professor," Marcus said, dropping a paper bag on the counter. "Brought breakfast. We gotta talk." Dana, half dressed for her diner shift, looked up from the sink and stiffened. "What's he doing here?" Eli glanced between them, uneasy. Marcus saw the machine run yesterday. "Yeah," Marcus said, leaning his hip on the counter and unwrapping 2 biscuits. "And I haven't stopped thinking about it. Listen, you got something real, Eli. But real needs protection and push. So here's my pitch." Dana frowned. "Pitch." Marcus took off his sunglasses and set them aside, suddenly less casual. "I put up enough cash to get you a patent attorney. Proper filings, maybe better components, so your test rig doesn't burn the house down. In return, I get a small stake, call it 15%. If this thing turns into a product, nothing shady. I've done it before. It's seed money, not a takeover." Eli blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. 15? Could argue for more, Marcus said, shrugging. "But I like betting on folks who work with their hands. You build a working prototype on fumes. I figure you'll stretch $1 better than most. We make sure no one steals it before you even get a chance." Dana turned, drying her hands too fast on a towel. "Absolutely not." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? You waltz in here with biscuits and big talk, but I know your game," she said, voice sharp from long years of worry. "Buy in cheap while something's improving. Flip it when it's worth something. You're a hustler, Marcus." He didn't get angry. He just smiled a little sadly. "I hustle scrap, sweetheart, not people. Your husband's got a shot at something bigger than a shed. I'm trying to help." Eli felt heat rise to his cheeks but kept quiet. Dana stepped closer, hands trembling with a different kind of fear. "Eli, please, don't get taken. Don't sign anything. We can't afford one more mistake." Eli looked from her to Marcus, then down at the table where his notes sprawled across brown paper. This was what he had wanted, a bridge between the shed and something real, but the leap terrified him too. He thought of how easily a man with cash could swallow an idea whole, how often small dreamers ended up watching someone else's name on their work. "I'm not signing anything today," Eli said finally, voice low but firm. Marcus nodded slowly. "Didn't expect you to. Just wanted it on the table. Think about it, ask around. I'll bring a contract, draft you can rip apart with a lawyer if you want. No rush, but don't wait forever. Ideas don't stay secret long." Dana snorted and turned away, muttering under her breath as she grabbed her keys. "If you want my vote, it's no. Last thing we need is some deal we don't understand." The door closed behind her, leaving silence and the faint smell of coffee. Marcus looked at Eli, expression softened now. "She's protective. Good woman, but she's scared." "She has reason," Eli said quietly. "Yeah, well, so, do you—" Marcus pushed the untouched second biscuit across the table. "Eat something, then call someone you trust about patents." When Marcus left, the house felt heavier but not hopeless. Eli sat staring at the papers, the machine humming only in memory now. For years, the only person who believed in his work was himself. Now someone outside wanted a piece, and that meant the thing might finally be worth something. But risk cut both ways. He folded the offer into his mind, neither rejecting nor embracing it, and went back to shed to think in the language he trusted most. Steel, copper, and quiet hours. The change started small, almost hidden, though Dana felt it before she saw it. After weeks of silence following Marcus's visit, a cautious agreement had been reached. Not a full handshake on partnership, but enough to unlock some of the seed money Marcus offered. Eli insisted on no papers yet, only a written understanding that the cash would cover patent filing and better equipment. Marcus surprised her by respecting that boundary, sending a simple check and a list of trusted suppliers. She still didn't like it, but she'd run out of ways to stop a man who finally seemed to know where he was going. The first delivery arrived on a rainy Thursday. Heavy crates smelling of new steel and oiled wood, a welder with crisp yellow paint, and an instruction manual thicker than their Bible. Another truck came a few days later with a drill press taller than Eli, gleaming and precise. The yard filled with pallets, cables, copper coils wrapped neat and new. Dana stood at the kitchen sink and watched, arms crossed, as Eli and Gus Avery wrestled each piece into the shed. Gus had agreed to help part-time. Just a few hours a week, he told her, old dog lending a paw. But she could see how alive the work made both men. Gus hadn't moved that easily in years. Soon the shed wasn't just a shed. Walls were cleared and lined with pegboards. Hand-labeled jars gave way to proper storage bins. The patched roof was replaced with clean corrugated steel, so rain no longer dripped onto the bench. New lights went in, bright white strips that banished the gloom and spilled a faint glow into the yard each night. Where there had once been a haphazard tinkerer's den, something like a small lab was taking shape. Dana felt the shift every evening when she came home from the diner. Before, she would return to a dark yard and one lonely bulb over a bent man's shoulders. Now the windows of the shed glowed like ship portholes, throwing long yellow bars onto the grass. She'd park and sit a minute in the quiet car, watching silhouettes move, Gus's broad outline, Eli's quick, deliberate motions, and feel a tangle of things she didn't want to name. Resentment. Yes, because the bills hadn't vanished, and because she was still the one stumbling home bone-tired. But curiosity, too, unwelcome and flickering whenever she glimpsed their faces lit with a purpose she couldn't ignore. Sometimes she would step out to bring them coffee, pretending it was just habit. She'd stand in the doorway, mug in hand, as the two men bent over wiring and diagrams. They barely looked up, lost in the rhythm of measuring and cutting, but Eli would always thank her softly, eyes bright in a way she hadn't seen in years. It unsettled her, that quiet light of competence coming back to him. Inside, Eli was transforming more than a room. He measured output with proper instruments now, not just a cheap multimeter. He spoke of safety tolerances and efficiency curves, Gus chiming in with the easy confidence of decades in machine shops. They sketched improvements on clean drafting sheets Marcus had brought by. The prototype grew neater, tighter, less like an accident, and more like something someone might trust enough to buy. Dana told herself it was all still fantasy. That one working motor didn't erase years of false starts. Yet sometimes, as she stood at the sink late at night, she'd catch herself watching the glow leak through the cracks of the shed and feel an ache she couldn't name, a longing maybe for him to prove her wrong, but not break her heart again. One night, she found herself on the back steps after midnight, wrapped in a sweater, staring at the lit windows. The hum of machinery floated faint and steady across the yard, mixed with Gus's low chuckle and Eli's quiet voice explaining a measurement. It was strange. That sound, not quite triumph, but steadiness, the way work sounds when it's finally going somewhere. She stayed until the cold bit through her sleeves, then went back inside, unsettled. In the morning, she told herself it meant nothing. The mortgage notice was still on the fridge. Her tips still barely covered groceries. But deep down, under the layers of worry, something fragile shifted. She wasn't ready to believe in him again, not out loud. But the shed had stopped being a place where dreams went to die. It had started to feel alive, and that, though she wouldn't say it, scared and intrigued her in equal measure. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee, and the overhead lights were too bright. Eli sat stiff in a chair that swallowed him whole, calloused hands folded in his lap, eyes moving between diagrams spread across a polished conference table. He had spent his life bending steel and coaxing use from broken things. Now he was expected to speak a new language, one of claims and prior art and provisional filings. His boots looked wrong against the neat gray carpet. Beside him sat Marcus, casual but alert, a man used to cutting deals, and across from them two patent attorneys with smooth hands and faster voices. This claim is too broad, one said, tapping a page. If you say energy recycler without narrowing its mechanism, you'll get rejected. We need specificity. And here, said the other, we should anticipate challenges. Waste heat recovery isn't new, but your configuration could be novel if we frame the coupling process right. Eli listened, frowning slightly, absorbing what he could. He didn't know these words, but he understood how things fit together, and that instinct hadn't failed him yet. He asked questions quietly, voice careful but steady, surprising the attorneys once or twice when he spotted a gap in their technical assumptions. Marcus smirked each time, proud in his sly way. The hours dragged. Papers signed, diagrams adjusted, fees discussed. Each number felt like a gut punch. Filing costs, search fees, attorney hours billed in fractions. Eli's stomach twisted at the thought of spending more than he'd made in a year just to protect an idea. But Marcus nodded at each figure, unflinching. Price of keeping wolves away, he said low, leaning toward Eli. Back home that night, Dana was waiting at the kitchen table. The bank notice still pinned to the fridge seemed to shout across the room. She looked up as Eli dropped a folder of papers with a dull thud. "That's what took all day?" she asked. "Patent draft," he said quietly. She leafed through the papers, eyes snagging on the legal jargon and fee schedules. "These numbers can't be real." "They're real," he answered. She let out a bitter laugh. "So now we're paying strangers thousands for what? A piece of paper saying you built a machine no one's bought yet." Eli didn't snap back. He just sat, shoulders heavy, looking down at his hands. "If I don't file, someone can take it. And if you do file," she pressed, "we're broke either way." "It's the only way to have a chance," he said, voice soft but firm. Dana closed the folder harder than she meant to. She wanted to scream at the absurdity, at Marcus's easy promises, at her husband's quiet gamble, but exhaustion dulled the edge. "We can't afford chance," she said finally, barely above a whisper. Eli looked up then, something raw and pleading in his eyes, but also a flicker of resolve. "I can't build something real and leave it naked. Not this time." For a moment she saw the boy he must have been, eager, hopeful, certain scrap could become more. It frightened her, but it tugged at something tender too. She broke the gaze first, pushing the papers back toward him. "Just don't let them take you for a ride." He nodded, relief subtle but there. "I won't." The weeks that followed blurred into meetings and revisions. Engineers vetted diagrams, making sure the invention could survive scrutiny. Gus tagged along sometimes, half amused, half protective, translating Eli's plain speech into terms the engineers could stamp and seal. Marcus handled invoices and negotiations, moving with the ease of a man used to tightrope deals. Eli endured, often silent but absorbing every lesson, stubborn in his need to see it through. Dana watched from a distance. She hated the bills stacking higher, but couldn't ignore the change in him. He came home bone-tired but alive, his hands black with work, but his eyes bright with a strange pride of someone stepping beyond the edges of his known world. Sometimes she'd catch herself staring at him while he talked quietly with Gus over blueprints, marveling and angry all at once. One evening, after another long day with the lawyers, Eli dropped a thick envelope on the counter. "Filed," he said simply. "Patent pending." Dana picked it up, thumb brushing the embossed seal. It was just paper, and yet she felt its weight, not only in dollars but in defiance. All this for a piece of paper, she muttered again, softer now, more weary than cruel. Eli nodded. "Yeah, but this one matters." She didn't answer. She just set it down and poured herself coffee, stealing one more glance at his face. Something about the quiet steadiness there unnerved her less than before. It didn't erase the fear of losing everything, but for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't chasing ghosts after all. The fairground smelled of fried dough and diesel, a jumble of food stands and tractor displays under the late summer sun. Bright banners flapped above the midway. But Eli's eyes stayed on the small corner lot Marcus had wrangled from the organizers, a patch of cracked asphalt near the farm equipment exhibits. Not glamorous, but it came with an outlet for safety backup and enough space to set up his rig. He and Gus had arrived at dawn to unload the prototype, which now sat proudly on a welded stand. Copper coils burnished to a dark gold, new housing gleaming under a fresh coat of matte paint. For once it didn't look like a heap of junk. It looked deliberate. Eli wiped sweat from his forehead and checked the couplings one more time. The setup was simple but clever. a diesel heater exhausting into a duct that fed straight into the recycler's intake. The machine would drink that waste heat, feed it back to its own alternator, and power a string of lights and box fans mounted along a truss. Visible proof of invisible work. He'd spent nights imagining it failing in front of strangers, the same humiliation his father had suffered. His stomach clenched hard at the thought. By mid-morning, the fair came alive. Families wandered past with lemonade and cotton candy. Teenagers drifted toward rides. Farmers examined shiny green tractors. Marcus, leaning against his truck, waved people over with the charm of a man who sold everything from baled hay to antique cash registers. "Come see something you ain't seen before," he called, turning waste into Watts, local build right here. At first, just a handful came. A couple of kids on bikes, an older man with grease under his nails, a mom with a stroller. They eyed the contraption skeptically. Eli cleared his throat, words sticking at first, but then found his voice. "This unit captures wasted heat, the stuff just going out the stack, and converts it back into usable electricity. No grid, no gas beyond what's already burning." Somebody snorted lightly. "Junk magic." Eli almost smiled. "Watch." He started the diesel heater, exhaust pipes shuddering as hot air rushed into the recycler's intake. The machine rumbled low, then steadied, coils glowing faintly. Slowly the bulbs strung across the truss flickered and then burned bright, one by one, until the whole line shone sharp against the daylight. The fans clattered alive, blades chopping air in a cool rhythmic hum. The crowd's chatter quieted, heads tilted, phones lifted. "Holy hell," the grease-fingered man muttered. A boy filmed wide-eyed while his dad whispered numbers under his breath, probably calculating fuel savings. More people drifted in, drawn by the sudden light and the unusual hush. The machine kept running. No sputter, no smoke, just a clean, steady hum. Eli felt something loosen inside his chest with each passing minute. Marcus played the crowd well, answering practical questions, tossing back quips, but deferring to Eli for the hard explanations. "No magic," he said with a grin. "Just smart recycling. Built right here, scrap turned to gold." Someone asked how long it could run. Eli gestured to the gauges. "As long as the heat source is there. Hours, days. We've tested it overnight." Phones kept rising. A young woman in work boots streamed live commentary for friends, panning across the glowing string of bulbs. Another man asked if it could scale. Eli swallowed and said quietly, "That's the plan." By the time the machine had been running a full hour, a loose half-circle of strangers surrounded them. The murmurs changed from disbelief to curiosity to excitement. A few business cards slipped into Marcus's hand. A man from a trucking outfit leaned in to talk about retrofitting long-haul rigs. Gus stood off to the side, arms crossed but grinning like a proud uncle. Eli hardly noticed the fair anymore. All he saw was a warm glow of proof, undeniable and public. The sound of laughter wasn't cruel this time. It was astonished, appreciative. He felt sweat trickle down his spine, but didn't flinch. He met people's eyes, explained wattage, answered practical doubts without shrinking. Somewhere in the throng, a familiar face caught his attention. Dana, standing back near the funnel cake stand, apron still tied, hair pulled up from her diner shift. She hadn't said she'd come, but there she was, arms folded, lips pressed tight, watching. Their eyes met only for a second before she looked away, but he'd seen it. The flicker of something softer than scorn. Maybe curiosity, maybe something she didn't want to admit yet. When the demo wound down, Marcus killed a heater and the lights dimmed slowly, fans spinning to a stop. A smattering of applause rose, small, awkward, but real. Eli's hand shook a little as he powered down, not from fear this time, but release. The prototype had faced strangers and stood. Marcus clapped him on the back hard enough to jolt his teeth. That, my friend, is how you show the world it's not just junk. Eli let the praise wash over him quietly, eyes still searching the crowd, until he found Dana once more. But she was gone, melted back into the fair's noise. Only the faint scent of fried dough lingered where she'd stood. He didn't know what she was thinking, but for the first time in years, he didn't need her belief to feel solid. The world had just seen it work, and so had she. The house was quiet except for the faint, buzz of Dana's phone on the kitchen counter. She'd toss it there after her shift, still smelling of coffee and fried onions, and try to ignore the notifications piling up. But curiosity had its own gravity. She sat down, apron still tied, and tapped one of the flashing icons. A video filled the screen, shaky but clear enough to show Eli's machine at the fair. The frame jumped as the phone's owner gasped. A row of bulbs flared to life while fans spun behind them, exhaust pipe breathing heat into the recycler. Eli stood off to one side, shoulders a little hunched, explaining something to a cluster of strangers. The caption read, "Local guy turned scrap into clean power. Junkyard genius lights up county fair." Beneath it, numbers ticked upward fast. Views in the thousands, comments streaming in faster than she could read. Dana froze, thumb hovering. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Just 2 days ago, she'd been warning him about scams and bills. Now here was the world, or some small, loud corner of it, calling him a genius. She scrolled. Comments stacked like an avalanche. "This is brilliant. DIY renewable energy. Patent that fast. I know a trucking company that would kill for this." Crazy how small towns still make the biggest ideas. There were laughing emojis too, but not the cruel kind. More amazement than mockery. Someone had tagged a clean energy influencer. Another wrote, "This guy just solved half my heating bill." A tech blogger with a blue check had shared the clip, writing, "Innovation doesn't always come from Silicon Valley." Dana swallowed hard. The screen blurred for a moment. She blinked fast. She hadn't seen her husband this way. Not awkward or failing, but competent, explaining something that clearly impressed strangers. And they weren't just clapping politely. They were excited. She tapped another clip. This one had better angles. Marcus talking up the system, kids peering close, Gus laughing as someone asked if they could buy one. In the background, Dana caught a glimpse of herself, just for a breath, standing at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The camera didn't linger, but seeing her own skeptical face there stung. It looked small and guarded in a sea of wonder. The comment thread under that post had turned wild. Debates about efficiency, links to energy forums, one person claiming to be from a startup wanting contact info. Someone else wrote, "Protect this man from investors. Too many sharks." Dana's jaw tightened at that. She knew enough to share the worry. From the living room, she heard the back door creak. Eli was home from another long night with Gus, probably putting the machine through fresh endurance tests. She didn't call out. Instead, she turned the phone screen down, hiding it like a secret. She wasn't ready to show him that she'd been watching. He came in quietly, boots scuffing, and moved the sink to wash his hands. "You're still up," he said, voice low. "Couldn't sleep," she answered, unsure why she was whispering. He nodded and dried his hands, looking as worn as ever, but with a subtle calm in his shoulders. She wanted to ask if he knew, if he'd seen the videos or the articles calling him Junkyard genius, but the words tangled somewhere behind her teeth. Instead, she asked something else, softer than she meant. "How's it running?" "Better every hour," he said. "Gus thinks we can push output another 20% with a few tweaks." She nodded, throat tight. He didn't mention the internet, and she didn't either. Maybe he hadn't seen. Maybe he was afraid to hope again. Later, when he'd gone upstairs in the house, settled into quiet breathing, Dana sat alone with the phone. More videos had surfaced. One from a tech TikTok channel already had 500,000 views. A photo of Eli beside the glowing lights had been turned into a meme, a man in grease-stained jeans with a caption, "Innovation doesn't care about your degree." The comments under that one were a swirl of applause and admiration. She found herself smiling despite the ache in her chest. Not the smug grin she used to wear when proving him wrong, but something smaller, reluctant. Pride and fear braided together. For years, she had felt alone holding the weight of bills, watching him chase ideas that ended in silence. Now the world seemed to be lifting him, noticing what she had long stopped believing could matter. She wanted to trust it, but couldn't yet. Internet storms passed as quickly as they came. But still, the spark had landed. Before her bed, she picked up the phone one more time and typed "patent waste heat recycler" into the search bar, just to see what protection cost, what fights might come. She wasn't ready to tell Eli she'd looked, But some part of her, stubborn, practical, needed to know how to keep sharks away if the tide really did turn. Then she set the phone down, glanced toward the dark stairs, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Careful, Eli." It was half warning, half something gentler she wasn't ready to name. The morning they came, the sky was flat gray, the kind that promised rain, but hadn't yet decided. Dana was rinsing mugs in the sink when a black SUV eased up the gravel drive. It looked alien against the weathered siding and the rust-streaked shed. The doors opened and two men stepped out, polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. They wore tailored coats, bright ties, city people in a yard built by calloused hands. For one startled moment, she thought of debt collectors. Then she saw the briefcases. Eli came in from the shed wiping grease on a rag, boots leaving small dark prints. He froze when he saw them at the porch, something guarded settling over his face. One man smiled with perfect practice warmth and extended a business card before even knocking. "Mr. Mercer? Good morning. I'm Paul Kendrick. This is Lydia Hahn. We're with Hartwell Energy Systems." Eli looked at the card but didn't take it right away. "You found us how?" Paul's grin didn't waver. "That fair video's everywhere. Impressive work. We help companies bring promising energy tech to market. Thought we'd stop by." Dana dried her hands slowly, distrust prickling at her skin. "Just like that? You saw a video?" Lydia's smile was cooler, sharper. "We also saw patent filings. You move fast. Smart." She turned to Eli. "We'd like to discuss licensing and possible acquisition." Eli's shoulders squared almost imperceptibly. "You can come in," he said, not warm, just polite. The kitchen felt too small with their suits and shiny shoes crowding the scuff table. Paul set down a sleek leather folder. Lydia opened a laptop that seemed to light the room unnaturally. They spoke in an easy practiced rhythm: market entry, prototype validation, manufacturing capacity. Numbers spilled out like coins from a torn pocket. Potential royalties, buyout options, research grants. Dana barely followed, but she caught enough to know they were talking about real money, the kind she'd never seen attached to anything in this house. Eli listened without nodding, expression unreadable. Occasionally he asked a question, measured, quiet, but cutting. "If you license, what control do I keep on design? What happens if you shelve the product? How do you treat independent inventors when the patent is contested?" Lydia's brows rose once or twice, as if surprised he wasn't awed. Paul smiled harder to smooth the edges. Dana watched, trying to reconcile the man she'd begged to grow up with the one calmly interrogating people who probably made more in a month than they had in a year. He wasn't playing genius or trying to impress. He was careful, almost stubborn, like a man who'd learned to mistrust bright promises. They stayed nearly 2 hours. At one point, Lydia slid a document across the table, a preliminary term sheet. Dana saw a number there that made her breath catch, enough to pay the mortgage, the diner debts, the hospital bill from her mother. But Eli didn't flinch. He just read, slow and deliberate, then pushed it back. "Too soon," he said. "We're still refining efficiency. I won't hand over something half-baked." Paul leaned forward. "Half-baked or not, there's interest. You're at risk the longer you wait." Eli's eyes were steady, the same patient calm he'd had in the shed under lantern light. "I've waited years to get this far. I can wait long enough to protect it right." Silence stretched. Even Lydia's typing paused. Then Paul chuckled softly, but not unkindly. "Fair enough. We'll leave our information. Call when you're ready to talk more." When the SUV finally crunched away, Dana sank into a chair, dizzy from the whiplash of seeing strangers assign value to what she dismissed as scrap. Eli stayed standing, hands braced on the table, staring at the empty space their folders had left. "You just sent them away," she said, voice thin with disbelief and maybe something like awe. "I sent them to wait," he answered quietly. "They offered." She stopped, unsure what Phil was pushing through: relief, frustration, pride. It was real money. "I know." He looked at her then, tired but steady. "But the wrong deal now could kill it before it lives. I'm not trading the whole thing just to breathe for a minute." Dana rubbed her face. torn between fear and a grudging admiration that felt new and strange. She wanted security. She'd beg for it. But watching him stand his ground without anger or apology did something to her she couldn't name. "They'll be back," she said finally. "Yeah," Eli replied, a faint smile tugging one corner of his mouth. "Or someone else will." He reached for the patent folder on the counter, sliding it closed like armor. Outside, the yard was quiet again except for a single loose shutter tapping in the breeze. The SUV was gone, but its tire marks cut dark into gravel, proof that the world had found them at last. And for the first time, Dana felt the weight shift, still heavy, still frightening, but no longer hopeless. Some part of her, however small, wondered if the man she'd once accused of dreaming his life away might just be ready for what came next. The kitchen smelled of coffee and welding smoke that had clung to Eli's jacket. Rain tapped the roof in slow, steady rhythms, soft enough that the sound of truck pulling in felt louder than it should. Marcus's green Ford rattled to a stop outside. Dana looked up from the stack of unpaid bills on the table, heart tightening with the now familiar mix of suspicion and reluctant hope. Eli was already wiping his hands on a rag as Marcus came in, boots damp, beard glistening with drizzle. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Marcus dropped his hat on the counter, shook out his coat, and reached into his jacket pocket. "Got something for you," he said. Eli frowned, wary. "What now?" Marcus grinned a little, but there was seriousness under it. He pulled out a long envelope and slid it across the table with a single smooth push. The paper whispered against the worn wood. "Advance on first production run," Marcus said. "Partner I know want to take a stake in the build. Early units for field testing. Some cash up front to get you moving. Clean terms, no tricks." Eli didn't touch the envelope right away. Dana couldn't help leaning closer. Through the windowed flap, she could see the faint print of a check, blue ink, and an unfamiliar company name. Her eyes caught the number and stuck there. The string of digits didn't make sense at first. She blinked, counted again, her breath catching sharp. 6 figures. Real undeniable. Enough to wipe their mortgage clean and breathe again for the first time in years. "You're serious," Eli said, voice low, almost disbelieving. "Serious as a heart attack," Marcus said. "You got something hot, Eli." Folks saw the fair. The views online didn't hurt. They want a field test. Maybe scale up if it holds. We keep control, your majority. This just gets parts, filings, and a production jig set up. Dana's hands trembled as she reached out, but stopped short of touching the envelope, as if it might vanish. Her throat felt dry. "That's all for machine?" she managed. "For your husband's machine," Marcus corrected gently, his grin softening at the edges. "For believing scrap can sing." Eli finally picked up the envelope, thumb tracing the embossed numbers like he needed to prove they weren't imagined. He didn't smile, not yet. His face was still cautious, eyes narrowing slightly as he read the memo line and the signature. "Clean?" he asked. "Clean," Marcus said. "I told him no vulturing. You control the patent, you call the shots. They get early units and a toe in the water." Dana sat back slowly, unable to speak. For so long she'd measured their life in overdue notices and diner tips. Now the table held a number bigger than her yearly wage written neatly on a check. She pressed both hands flat against the wood to stop their shaking. Her eyes burned before she realized tears were coming. Eli looked at her across the table, something unspoken passing between them. Not triumph, just a deep, quiet relief, a crack opening in the long wall of worry. He slid the check toward her gently, as if sharing proof of something he'd chased so long alone. She swallowed hard. "It's real," she whispered, half to herself. "Real enough to buy a little time," Eli said softly. Her laugh came out shaky and broken. "And all this time I told you to grow up." He reached for her hand, rough palm brushing hers, hesitant but steady. "Maybe I just finally did," he said. She looked at him then, really looked. The tired lines, the grease that never quite left his skin, the stubbornness she called foolish so many nights. But now there was something else in his eyes. Quiet steadiness, a man who hadn't given up when she almost had for him. Pride swelled in her chest, surprising and fierce. Marcus cleared his throat, breaking the moment but not ruining it. You two stare all you want, but deposit that before somebody changes their mind. Dana laughed a little through her tears, wiping at her eyes with the heel of her hand. Guess I'll stop calling it garbage, she said. Eli smiled at last, small, tired, but real. Guess so. The rain kept tapping the roof as Marcus left, boots splashing through puddles. Dana stayed at the table, fingers still curled around the edge of the check. The house felt different, lighter in some way that wasn't about money alone. She didn't know what tomorrow's fights would be, patents still pending, production ahead, sharks still circling. But for the first time in a long time, fear didn't fill every corner. Eli poured fresh coffee, set a mug by her hand. She met his eyes and found no gloating there, only relief and a kind of gratitude that humbled her. She gave a small, unsteady nod. Okay, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. He reached over, covered her shaking fingers with his callous ones, and together they stared at the slip of paper, proof that the world had finally put weight behind a dream built from rust and patience. The house was hushed except for the faint hum of work coming from the shed. Through the kitchen window, Dana could see the thin stripe of light cutting across the yard, a pale golden seam against the dark. Rain from earlier had left the grass shining in patches. Puddles caught the glow every time Eli moved past the door. She stood there for a long time, arms wrapped around herself, listening to the rhythm of distant clanks and the low thrum of some tests running. It had been a strange week. The check sitting in an envelope on the counter, the first mortgage payment scheduled to clear without panic, the inbox filling with messages from people she'd never heard who wanted to buy, invest, collaborate. She'd watched Eli handle it all quietly. No gloating, no speeches, just careful steps and more hours at the bench. And somehow that calm made her shame heavier. She had told him to grow up, to sell the tools, to stop, had said garbage and wasted time. All while he worked alone, carrying beliefs she couldn't or wouldn't give. Now the world was saying genius where she'd said failure. The guilt had settled inside her chest like something sharp but slow-moving, cutting only when she was alone. She pulled on a sweater and stepped into the night, cool, damp air brushing her face. The shed door creaked softly when she pushed it open. Eli glanced up, surprised but not startled, lamplight catching the fine metal dust in his beard. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "No," she said, voice small. He nodded and went back to tightening a coupling, not pressing. She stood watching him work, the familiar quiet that used to frustrate her now strangely comforting. For a long time, the only sounds were his tools and the faint buzz of the motor idling on a bench test. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Eli." He looked up, brow furrowed, hands stilling. "I need to say something." He waited, patient the way he always was with machines that needed coaxing. Her fingers twisted in the hem of her sweater. "I didn't believe in you," she said softly. The words came out like a confession she'd rehearsed but still dreaded. "Not for a long time. I was so scared about the bills, about losing the house, about everything, and I made that fear your fault. I should have trusted you, at least enough not to tear you down." Eli's face stayed quiet but softened. He didn't rush to fill the silence. She took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. For every time I laughed, for every time I called it junk. You didn't deserve that." He set the wrench down slowly, wiped his hands on a rag. When he spoke, his voice was low, but even. "You were scared. So was I. That's no excuse." He gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe not, but I get it." He studied her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw not triumph, but something gentler, a kind of worn-out grace. "You kept us afloat while I tried. That matters too." Tears pricked, surprising her. She blinked fast and looked down at the concrete floor. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. For the first time in years, a smile reached his eyes. He didn't say thank you, didn't make it grand. Just stepped closer and touched her shoulder with a hand still warm from work. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. They stood that way a minute, quiet filling the shed, broken only by the soft whir of the test motor. Outside, the drizzle started again, pattering gently on the new metal roof. Dana looked around the room, the organized tools, the clean notes tacked neatly, the machine humming steady and sure. It no longer felt like a place where hope went to die. It felt alive, earned. "I want to help," she said suddenly. "However I can." Eli chuckled softly, a sound like relief. "You already are." She stayed a while, passing him tools, holding a light as he made small adjustments. Nothing big, just the easy rhythm of two people side by side. Later, when they went back inside, she reached for his hand on the porch steps and didn't let go. In bed, long after the lamp was off, she whispered one last time into the dark, "I'm sorry," and felt his fingers squeeze hers gently in answer. It wasn't an ending or a grand fix, but it was the first real night in years where guilt and gratitude shared the same breath, and the silence between them felt like something healing instead of broken. By the end of some of the shed had become too small for what was happening inside it. Orders were whispering in from pilot partners Marcus had sniffed out, trucking depots wanting field units, a factory in Indiana asking about custom sizing. Even a call from a renewable trade magazine that wanted photos. Eli's workbench, once cluttered with scavenged bolts and mismatched wire, now overflowed with polished housings and printed circuit boards ordered new. Gus, who used to wander over for a few hours a week, was showing up every morning at 7, lunch pail in hand, joking that retirement had been overrated anyway. The yard transformed first. Marcus arrived one morning with a rented backhoe and a grin, and by noon the old sagging shed lay in a heap of splintered boards. Dana stood at the kitchen window and watched the demolition, arms crossed tight, trying to ignore the pang of nostalgia and fear. That shed had been the battleground for years of argument and doubt. Tearing it down felt like erasing every warning she'd ever shouted. But by evening, when fresh gravel arrived and stakes marked a new foundation, she found herself unexpectedly hopeful. Something real enough to need walls was coming. Eli moved slower with this new build than he ever had with the prototype. He and Gus measured twice, pore over plans for ventilation and power lines, argued gently about bench heights and safe walkways. Marcus brought in a pair of local kids fresh out of trade school, Kyle and Robbie, to help pour concrete and frame walls. They came cheap and hungry to learn. Eli taught them the way Gus had taught him. Quiet, patient, no shortcuts. By the third week, the bones of a proper workshop stood tall, metal siding gleaming silver in the sun, wide doors that could swallow whole pallets of material. Inside, heavy tables replaced rickety ones. New presses and welders gleamed alongside still-loved hand tools. Dana tried to keep her distance at first. The money terrified her. Lumber, machines, wages, even with a check tucked safely in the bank. She still worked long shifts at the diner, but each evening she found herself walking the perimeter of the new building, peeking in to see Gus and the boys laughing as they hoisted conduit. Eli bent over wiring blueprints. Pride and anxiety warred inside her chest. One night, Eli caught her lingering in the doorway. "Need something?" he asked without looking up. "Maybe," she said, swallowing her nerves. "Your invoices are a mess." He looked up then, surprised, grease-streaked and tired. "Probably." "I can help," she said, almost shy. "Bookkeeping. At least until you can hire someone." His smile came slow and careful, but warm. "Wouldn't mind that." And so she began, at first reluctantly, just sorting receipts, setting up a ledger, making sense of supplier bills. But numbers were something she trusted. They let her keep a hand on the runaway train this business might become. Soon she was building spreadsheets late at night, tracking expenses and purchase orders, drawing up neat summaries Eli could hand to Marcus instead of crumpled scraps of paper. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. She still worried. Every check sent to supplier made her flinch. Every payroll line for Gus and the boys made her stomach tighten. But slowly she saw a balance returning, not just to their finances, but to their marriage. Eli brought her questions now, about terms, about tax forms, about whether it was time to talk to a bigger accountant. He still lived mostly in the world of steel and copper, but he'd begun to trust her with the world of paper and numbers. The workshop finished in late autumn. A new sign, nothing fancy, just Mercer Reclamation System stenciled in dark paint, went up above the wide bay doors. Gus stood back and whistled low when it was done. "Never thought I'd be clocking in again," he said, but his grin betrayed no regret. The young men came early on the first real day of work, eyes bright at the thought of building something local and new. That night, Dana stood with Eli outside the building. Warm light spilled through the high windows. Inside, tools gleamed and the first small assembly line waited for morning. She slipped her hand into his, no longer hesitant. "You built this," she said quietly. "We built this," he answered, glancing at her with that small, crooked smile she'd nearly forgotten he had. "Took long enough." She laughed softly and leaned her head against his shoulder. The fear hadn't vanished, not yet, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. There was room now for pride, and for gratitude she was still struggling to put into words. The shed that had once divided them was gone. In its place stood something larger, steadier, born from every long night and bitter fight, but alive enough to hold them both. For the first time in years, Dana didn't feel like she was waiting for the next collapse. She felt like they were building something that might actually stand. The first sign came in the form of a knock on the new shop's wide sliding door one crisp Saturday morning. Eli looked up from a half-assembled housing as the metal rattled softly. Outside stood Frank Marlowe, who had once called him Professor Scrap, loud enough for everyone at the hardware store to hear. Frank held his cap in both hands like a schoolboy, shifting his weight. "Morning," Frank said, awkward. "Heard you're making real power out of thin air. Figure I should come see instead of run my mouth." Eli didn't gloat. He just wiped his hands and opened the door wider. "Come in, Frank." The man wandered slowly among the workbenches, eyes catching on copper coils and tidy rows of parts. "Never figured you for business, Eli. Guess I was wrong." Eli only nodded, and Frank looked relieved he wasn't going to be punished with triumph. Before leaving, he asked, halting, if Eli thought the recycler could help with his small sawmill's heating costs. Eli said maybe they'd talk. Frank's grin was sheepish but real as he left. After that, the current shifted almost overnight. Folks who once chuckled over beers at the VFW started stopping by with curious questions or quiet congratulations. Old men in work coats offered leftover stock metal. Teenagers rode bikes up the drive just to gawk at the shop's big bay doors. Even the pastor wandered over one afternoon, claiming he wanted to bless the building, but really just wanted to see the machine he'd read about in the paper. Dana felt the change most sharply at the diner. For years, she'd endured the sideways jokes. Her co-workers calling Eli she had the landfill. Customers chuckling when she mentioned her husband's tinkering. That first week after fair, the teasing turned tentative, then stopped entirely. And the day she finally drove her new truck. A used but shiny silver pickup Marcus had talked her into when the first real deposit hit the account. The whole parking lot went silent for a beat. Boots scraped tile. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. "That yours?" asked Lisa, one of the loudest past skeptics, eyes wide. Dana set her keys on the counter with a little clink. "Sure is." Lisa blinked. Guess Eli's junk paid off. Dana could have snapped back, but something softer moved in her instead. "It's not junk," she said calmly. "Never was. I just didn't see it." By lunch, the gossip had shifted from pity to curiosity. Someone asked if they were hiring. Another wondered aloud how to invest. Dana didn't answer everything. She just smiled a little and took orders like usual, but inside, something long knotted began to loosen. In the evenings, a driveway filled with trucks and old sedans. People wanted to look to pitch ideas. Could the recycler be scaled to heat a greenhouse? Could it run a fish hatchery pump? Eli listened politely, notebook in hand, but never promising what he couldn't yet do. He still moved slow, thoughtful, refusing to let excitement spin out of control. Dana sometimes stood back and watched, neighbors she bristled against now nodding to her with real respect, even gratitude. The pride in her chest was strange and new, tempered with humility. She remembered every time she'd told Eli to stop dreaming. Every night she left him alone in that cold shed. And yet here they were, the same hands that once scraped for tip money now signing paychecks for Gus and the kids. That night, after the last neighbor's taillights vanished down the road, she found Eli outside locking up. "Big day," she said quietly. He smiled, the slow kind that started in his eyes. "Weird one. They're coming around." "People like a fire once it's burning," he said with a small shrug, but there was no bitterness in it. She stepped closer, tugged lightly at the sleeve of his work shirt. "I'm glad I stuck around long enough to see it. Eli looked at her for a long moment, something warm and steady behind his tired face. Me too. They stood together watching the new shop glow faintly against the dark. Behind them, the silver truck caught a shard of moonlight, quiet proof of change, but not the loud, showy kind. Dana felt the ground under her feet differently than she had in years. Solid, earned. The town might just be beginning to believe, but she finally let herself join them, and that, she realized, felt better than any check or headline could. The white van came first, big satellite dish strapped awkwardly to its roof. Dana saw it from the kitchen window and felt her stomach clench. She'd known the crew was coming. Marcus had warned them. But something about seeing the network logo stenciled across the side made it real in a way she hadn't been ready for. Men and women with cameras and gear spilled out, all black jackets and quick, purposeful movements. The quiet gravel driveway seemed to shrink under their boots. Eli came out of the shop wiping his hands. Still in his work shirt, dark smudges on his sleeves. He looked at the small swarm and lifted one hand in a cautious hello, the same way he might greet deer crossing the yard. A woman with a clipboard strode forward, bright smile and polished voice. "Mr. Mercer, we're with the feature segment. Thanks for having us." Eli glanced toward Dana, standing on the porch, unsure. She forced herself down the steps, past the odd tangle of cables and tripods. "We've got coffee if you need," she said automatically, the way she would at the diner. The woman smiled, appreciative but brisk. "Perfect. We'll get some establishing shots outside first. Shop exterior. Maybe you two walking in together?" She was already signaling to a cameraman. Dana wanted Bolt back inside, but Eli just nodded and gestured toward the new building. So they walked side by side as cameras rolled, his easy, unhurried gait making her feel less like prey. Inside, the crew fanned out, marveling at the organized benches, the rows of polished prototypes. Someone whistled low. Another murmured about authentic spaces. Dana thought the whole thing absurd. It was just a workshop, concrete floors and the smell of metal and oil. But seeing strangers treat like a cathedral filled her with strange pride she tried to hide. The interview started at a workbench. They clipped a microphone to Eli's collar. He looked down at it like it was some delicate part he didn't quite trust. The lead journalist, a woman with warm eyes but sharp questions, perched on a stool opposite him. "People are calling you the Junkyard genius," she began. "How does that feel?" Eli scratched at his beard, clearly uncomfortable but steady. "I just build things," he said softly. "Didn't set out to be called anything. What kept you going all those years when no one believed?" He looked past her for a moment, toward the wall where the first rough sketches still hung. "Didn't know how to quit," he said simply. "And some part of me wanted to finish what my dad started. Make something from nothing." Dana watched from just out of frame, arms crossed, heart thudding. She hadn't expected the camera to turn on her. But suddenly it did. "Mrs. Mercer," the journalist said, smiling kindly. "You were skeptical at first." Heat flooded her cheeks. "That's putting it nice," she admitted. "I worried. A lot. Bills, the house. I didn't think it would work. I told him to stop more than once." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. But he didn't, and he was right. The room went quiet for a beat, camera lenses gleaming like patient eyes. Dana swallowed and looked at Eli. He gave the smallest nod, not smug, just gentle, like forgiving her again in real time. The crew filmed for hours, Eli showing the machine's guts, Gus chiming in with a wry joke or two, young Kyle demonstrating assembly with proud, clumsy enthusiasm. They got shots of the shop sign, the silver truck pulling in, the family dog trotting to the doorway. Marcus showed up halfway through and charmed the producers, though Eli kept a steady hand on the story's truth. No exaggerated fairy tale, just hard work and quiet persistence. When the sun dipped low, the cameras finally powered down. The lead journalist shook Eli's hand firmly. "You're going to inspire a lot of people," she said. He only shrugged but smiled shyly. After the vans pulled away and the yard went still again, Dana and Eli sat on the porch steps with cooling mugs of coffee. The sky burned peach over the new shop. For a while, neither spoke. "You did good," Dana said at last. He glanced at her, brow raised. Even you? Even me, she said, a small smile tugging. Then softer, I was terrified the whole time. Me too, he admitted. Still am. They sat a while longer, listening to the night come back. The hum of cameras was gone, but another kind of hum lingered. The sense of something growing beyond them now, a story leaving home to walk on its own. Dana reached over, laced her fingers with his. Guess the world's finally seeing what was here all along. He squeezed back gently, eyes on the glowing shop. Guess so. And for once, neither needed to fill the silence with anything more. By winter, the quiet yard that had once only known the rumble of Marcus's old truck began to see cars with tinted windows and plates from out of state. The TV piece had done what no county fair could. It pulled bigger eyes toward the small Ohio shop. Emails multiplied until Dana had to create a separate inbox just for inquiries. Some were flattering but vague. Others came letterhead and crisp, full of legal phrasing that made her dizzy. The names alone felt unreal. Titan Renewables, Green Forge Systems, Edison Thermal. One cold Monday, Marcus showed up early, hat low over his eyes and a grin hidden in his beard. They're coming, he said, dropping into the kitchen chair like a man bracing for weather. Big ones. Money men with soft hands and sharp teeth. Don't let it scare you. Dana shot him a look over her coffee. Scared isn't the word I'd use. But her stomach churned anyway. That afternoon, 2 sedans rolled up, engines purring like cats. Suits emerged, men and women with leather portfolios and phones glued to their palms. They toured the new workshop with polished enthusiasm, praising every detail, asking about scalability, patents, manufacturing capacity. Eli stayed quiet but alert, answering when needed, letting Marcus field the layered corporate talk. When someone tried to slide talk toward buyouts and majority control, Marcus cut in smooth but hard. Licensing's on the table. Ownership isn't, he said, arms folded across his chest. Eli glanced at him, grateful but silent. Over the next weeks, it became a pattern. Firms flew people in, bearing glossy presentations and promises. Dana started keeping coffee stocked like ammunition. She'd slip in and out of meetings, taking notes when terms got slippery, quietly Googling jargon under the table. She surprised herself with how fiercely protective she felt. Eli never played showman. He wore his same work shirts, sat with hands clasped and listened more than he spoke. But when he did answer, his plainness cut through the polish. We build it tough because it's got to run where folks can't babysit it. He'd say, you want to slap a fragile circuit on there? I'm not interested. Some execs looked offended. Others leaned in, sensing real ground under his words. Marcus, on the other hand, thrived in the swirl. He smiled wide, steered talk back to licensing and royalty percentages, framed every number in a way Eli could weigh without drowning in jargon. Slowed down, he'd tell a too eager rep. We're not signing away the goose just because you brought a golden pen. The offers climbed anyway. First low 6 figures to manufacture a few units under their banner. Then mid-7 to scale. Then an eye-widening 8-digit proposal from a West Coast firm that promised plants, staff, a fleet of engineers. Dana's breath caught when she read that one. For a moment, she imagined debts gone forever. College for nieces and nephews. The life she dreamed but never dared name. But Eli didn't flinch. He looked at the paper for a long time, thumb tapping lightly. Then he shook his head. Too fast. Not ready. Dana wanted to scream, but something in his calm stopped her. She was beginning to understand this man who'd spent decades being doubted. He wouldn't trade control just to buy peace. Not after fighting this far. One evening, after another long round of negotiations ended and the yard was quiet again, she found him sitting on the shop's back steps, staring at the frost-tipped grass. You could have taken it, she said, sitting beside him. I know. It was a lot of money. He nodded, thoughtful. Money's not the end. Building it right is. She leaned against his shoulder, surprising them both. You're smarter than they think. He chuckled softly. Took me long enough. Inside, Marcus was still on the phone with some contact out west, setting slower, fairer terms. Dana listened to the muted rumble of his voice and realized how different life felt now. Still risky, still uncertain, but not desperate. They were no longer prey. The investment offers would keep coming. She knew that, but she also knew something had shifted. Eli's quiet dignity, once mistaken for smallness, was becoming strength. And Marcus, loud and cunning, used that strength like a shield instead of a weapon. The world wanted peace, but this time, the Mercers weren't walking blind. When the next car rolled up the drive a few days later, another glossy firm of promises and contracts, Dana didn't feel small. She set out mugs and smiled politely, knowing she was part of this now too. Watching Eli meet polished strangers eye to eye, she felt a kind of fierce pride that needed no headlines. Whatever happened next, they weren't just a dream and a shed anymore. They were a company, a story, and a family learning how to stand together under the weight of success. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind Dana would have once called forgettable. Rain streaked the kitchen window. The coffee pot hissed and popped. She sat down with her laptop to do what had become routine, paying invoices, checking deposits from licensing deals Marcus had helped structure, watching numbers she still didn't fully believe belonged to them. For years, the screen had been an enemy. She remembered nights when the bank's site would buffer forever, her heart pounding as she waited to see if there was enough to cover the mortgage, if the electric bill could be pushed another week. That history lived in her fingers. Even now, she typed the password slowly, bracing for bad news. The account page opened with a faint electronic chime. At first, she skimmed like usual. Payments out to suppliers, payroll for Gus and the boys, small deposits from early pilot contracts. Then her gaze snagged on the balance at the top right corner. She blinked once, leaned closer. The number didn't look real. Commas in new places. 7 digits. For a long moment, she simply stared. The room tilted a little. She imagined what safety might feel like, but never pictured an actual string of numbers with that many zeros. She whispered them out loud, voice shaking. 1 million. The sound of it felt foreign, like trying a language she hadn't spoken before. She laughed once, a startled, broken sound, then clapped a hand over her mouth as tears stung her eyes. After all the years of scraping tips into jars, of pawning jewelry, of folding foreclosure warnings into trash, so Eli wouldn't see how afraid she was. The idea that their account now held enough to pay everything and still breathe seemed impossible. The kitchen blurred. She wiped at her face, laughing and crying at the same time. No cameras, no headlines, no one to impress. Just her, a mug of cooling coffee, and a screen quietly rewriting the story of their lives. She thought of the shed, of nights she'd stood in the doorway spitting anger because fear felt safer than hope, of how Eli never stopped, how he'd sat hunched under lantern light, soldering copper, while she told him to grow up. Shame slid through her but didn't stay bitter. It softened into gratitude for his stubbornness, for the way he'd never thrown her doubt back at her even when the world finally caught up. Footsteps came down the hall. Eli appeared, hair still damp from a quick shower before heading to the shop. He looked as he always did, plain flannel shirt, work boots, that calm behind his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked when he saw her face. She shook her head and turned the laptop toward him, still wiping at her cheeks. "It's not wrong," she said, voice cracking. "Look." He leaned over her shoulder, brow furrowing as he took in the screen. For a second, he just stared. Then the faintest smile touched his mouth, small and private. "Huh? That's all you've got? Huh?" She half laughed, half sobbed. He chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I don't know what you're supposed to say." "You did this," she whispered. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, heavy and warm. "We did this," he said. Dana covered her face with both hands, overwhelmed. He stayed quiet, letting her breathe, until she looked up again. "I was so sure we'd lose everything," she said. "I was so sure I'd lose you too." He shook his head gently. "We were close, but we didn't." They sat together at the kitchen table as rain pattered the windows, the screen glowing quietly between them. There was no grand celebration, no popping champagne, just a deep, almost holy stillness of survival turning into security. Finally, Dana reached out and closed the laptop. "We should probably get to work," she said, wiping her eyes one last time. Eli grinned faintly. "Big day?" "Biggest yet," she said. and to her surprise, meant it not for the money but for the peace settling in at last. She stood and wrapped her arms around him, clumsy and sudden. He smelled of soap and machine oil and everything safe. "I'm proud of you," she whispered again, steadier this time. He held her quietly for a long while before pulling back just enough to look her in the eye. "I'm proud of us." The rain kept falling, soft and steady, as they stepped into a day that felt unlike any other, not because of the number in the bank, but because, for the first time in years, they weren't standing on the edge. They'd built something strong enough to hold. The invitation wasn't really an invitation. Marcus had tossed the idea out one afternoon while he and Gus finished bolting down a new test rig. Ought to mark the first run of the production line somehow. Eli frowned, as if celebration might jinx something. Dana, listening from the office corner where she was balancing books, said quietly, "Maybe we should." Nobody used the word party. Still, by Friday evening the new shop smelled faintly of fresh sawdust and slow-cooked stew, and a few folding tables had appeared along one wall. It was a kind of gathering that built itself. Gus came early with his wife and a cooler of root beer. Kyle and Robbie showed up in their stained coveralls, but with nervous haircuts, lugging a speaker that only half worked. Dana roasted a couple of chickens and cut a loaf of bread, while Marcus hauled in a pot of chili that smelled rich enough to make everyone stop and breathe it in. No one dressed up. No one needed to. The machines along the line hummed softly, running a mild burn-in test for the new components. Their low, steady sound filled the space like music. Not loud enough to drown voices, just present enough to remind everyone why they were there. Light spilled warm and golden from the high windows. The concrete floor still looked new, but scuffs from boots were starting to tell stories. Eli moved through the small crowd awkwardly, but with a quiet kind of ease. He refilled Gus's root beer, made sure the kids had enough chili, answered a few questions about upcoming shipments. When Frank Marlowe wandered in late, hat in hand, and offered a rough congrats, Eli didn't gloat or bristle. He just nodded and clapped Frank on the shoulder. The simple grace of it seemed to relax the whole room. Dana floated at the edges for a while, watching people laugh where once they'd whispered. The diner girls had come too, curious more than anything. Lisa lingered by a workbench, tracing a finger over the smooth new housings lined up for shipment. "Looks like space stuff," she muttered, half to herself. Dana only smiled. "It's just our stuff." Someone turned the broken speaker on, and soft country music filled the background. People talked shop, whether kids. Gus told an old story about Eli's father that made everyone chuckle and quiet at once, about the man who taught Eli to make a boat from nothing but a rod and patience. Eli didn't say much, but his face shifted, proud and sad. When the first prototype, the battered paint-scratch unit that had survived fire and failure, was wheeled out from a back shelf, the group gathered without being asked. Kyle plugged it into a small exhaust heater, flipped the switch, and soon the familiar warm hum filled the big shop. Lights strung across the wall blinked alive, then steadied to a clean glow. A cheer went up, small but heartfelt. Eli smiled, eyes shining just a little. Dana stepped close, touched his arm. He looked at her, and she saw relief, gratitude, and something lighter than she'd ever seen there. Not just victory, but the quiet safety of being believed. She squeezed his hand once, no words. After a while, people began drifting out, leaving empty plates and a gentle mess behind. Marcus lingered last, leaning in the doorway, satisfied grin under his beard. "Not bad for a shed dream," he said. Eli only chuckled. When it was finally just them, Eli, Dana, Gus, and the two young workers sweeping up, the machine still hummed softly, tireless. Dana leaned against the work table, hair loose, feet sore but light. She looked around at the space that had once been impossible and felt a warmth she couldn't name. No champagne popped, no speeches were made. But when Gus clapped Eli's back and said, "Proud of you, kid," and when Dana whispered quiet me too, that only Eli heard, it felt larger than any toast. They locked up together under a cold, clear sky. As the lights went out one by one, the hum faded but didn't disappear. It lingered inside, steady and alive. Dana slipped her hand into Eli's on the walk back to the house. Neither spoke, because some milestones didn't need words. The night itself seemed to know. The junkyard hadn't changed much. Rows of twisted frames and dented hoods still leaned against each other like drunks, the air thick with oil and rain-soaked iron. A cold wind ran over the acres of wreckage, carrying the faint buzz of saws from some distant corner. Eli stepped out of his truck and shut the door quietly, as though not wanting to disturb the ghosts. He hadn't been here in a long time. Too busy building, filing, meeting. Too busy proving everything could be different. But some part of him had wanted this, to come back alone when the noise of success had faded enough to let him hear the old silence again. He walked the familiar aisles slowly, boots crunching on gravel. Over there was a stack of bent heat exchangers where he'd first spotted the hulking Harrington motor that started it all. Further on, the trailer where Martin, the yard's owner, used to watch him like a hawk and occasionally shake his head in disbelief. It looked smaller now, the way things do when you're no longer afraid. Martin himself emerged from the doorway, older but still sharp-eyed under his cap. "Well, I'll be," he called, voice gravelly, "if it ain't the junkyard genius." Eli chuckled and held up a hand. "Morning, Martin. Come back to scavenge or just to gloat?" "Neither," Eli said with a faint smile. "Just visiting." Martin leaned against a post, arms crossed. "Heard you're building real machines now. Big orders, patents, money. Folks talk. Some of that's true." Eli let his gaze roam over the rusted carcasses. "But it started here." Martin snorted. "That it did. You were a stubborn one, always hauling out the heaviest, ugliest pieces, swearing you'd make 'em sing." He shook his head, but there was no mockery in it. "Guess you did." They stood together a while, silence comfortable. Then Eli drifted off again, deeper into the yard, until he found a familiar patch of ground near the fence where the motor had once sat waiting for someone foolish enough to drag it home. Only a scatter of bolts and an oil stain remained. Nearby, half buried under other scrap, a small rusted gear caught his eye. Ordinary, nothing special, teeth dulled and edges flaked with orange. He bent and picked it up, turning it over his palm. It weighed almost nothing, yet it felt heavier than the first $1 million had. He ran his thumb across the worn teeth and felt the echo of nights alone in the shed, the lantern's breath, the hiss of solder, Dana's angry footsteps fading down the hall. All the fear, the small humiliations, the steady grind of hope that refused to die. This was where he'd gambled when everything said stop. Not for money, not for headlines, but to prove that failure wasn't the only ending. He smiled, small, quiet, the kind that doesn't need an audience. He wasn't thinking about investors or contracts now, just a boy who'd once handed wrenches to his father, and the man who'd refused to let that dream end in smoke and laughter. Martin wandered up behind him. "Find something worth taking?" "Just a reminder," Eli said softly. Martin eyed the gear and nodded. "Take it. On the house. Call it a souvenir." Eli slipped it into his pocket. They shook hands, a simple, rough clasp that carried more than either man said aloud. On the drive home, the gear sat on the dash, catching bits of pale winter sun. Dana would probably tease him for dragging more rust into the house, but maybe she'd understand too. Some trophies aren't meant for glass cases. As the shop came into view, gleaming metal and tall doors where a sagging shed once stood, Eli felt no urge to measure how far he'd come in dollars. The proof was simpler, a life rebuilt from the same quiet persistence he'd once been mocked for. He parked, left the truck running for a moment, and touched the gear again before slipping it into his jacket pocket. It was just scrap, but then, so was everything once.